Thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jonathan Eubank. I direct ERINHA. So ERINHA is the European research infrastructure on highly pathogenic agents. So it federates high containment facilities in Europe. And ERINHA is coordinating ISIDORE, and that's why we're here today. So the morning is going to be devoted to a general session, and we have a broad audience. And then in the afternoon, we're going to have a more dedicated session to ISIDORE business, and tomorrow as well. Before going further, there are some housekeeping rules. So for those of you who are online, welcome also. So we've got a large number of people who are online. I remind you that ISIDORE is a project that brings together more than 150 different partners in 32 countries. For the Zoom participants, so please stay muted unless you're called on to speak. Ensure your name includes your full name and affiliation, and use the chat function or raise your hand to ask a question at the end of the session. And for those in the room, when you ask questions, please say who you are and where you're from. We will have to give you microphones so that the people online can hear you. As you may have seen for the people in the room, so there is Wi-Fi here. If you need to remember the password, Bertie makes delicious apple butter sandwiches, and that was obviously ChatGPT who provided that in a second. But I would ask you to try to not distract your neighbors by sitting on your devices, but pay attention to what the people are saying. So with no more ado, so the next slide, I think, is going to be so the agenda, which I hope you've all seen. And I'm going to hand over to Audrey Richard, who most of you know. So Audrey was very intimately involved in setting up the proposal, and she is ERINHA's Director of Operations. Audrey.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning, everybody. I do know most of you already. I'm very happy to see you all here. Thank you for those that are attending online also. So I'm going to try to keep it on time. So I'm going to put it here. And so the idea here is to, before we go through the external speakers and kind of the European preparedness landscape, I still wanted to give you an overview of the ISIDORE project for those of you that are not like fully familiar with it. So I'm going to go back a little bit in time and go back to the whole idea and the beginning of the story that was basically the occurrence of the COVID-19 pandemic. For a lot of people back then, it was said that the COVID-19 pandemic was not expected, it was very sudden, but actually it was not that unexpected. It was very sudden, but it was not unexpected, because if you go back in time, not that much before the occurrence of the first cases, actually there was a publication of a report that was called A World at Risk, as you can see on the screen. I was already identifying, that was published in September 2019, that was already kind of predicting that high impact respiratory pathogens, such as an especially deadly strain of influenza, could pose particular global risks in our time. Additionally, some specialists in preparedness and risk assessment did consider that the most probable naturally occurring global catastrophic biological risk level threat that humans face were respiratory-borne RNA viruses, and so that we should consider them preparedness priorities. That was a quote from Dr. Ramesh Adalja in 2018 already. So there is actually an increasing risk of outbreaks and pandemics. This was true before, this is still true. And the probability of a pandemic with a similar impact to COVID-19 is actually 2% each year, which means that any people on Earth has a probability of experiencing something similar to the COVID-19. That probability is 38% in their lifetime. So this is actually pretty high. and the recent occurrence of the COVID-19 pandemic, it should not give us the impression that we are good to go and that we are safe now for a few decades. This has nothing to do with that. You are probably already aware that one of the major drivers of those like increasing risk of outbreaks and pandemics in general is climate change. And over half of infectious diseases, they are aggravated by climate change. This is based on a systematic search for empirical example about the impact of 10 climatic hazards to greenhouse gas emissions on each known human pathogenic disease. Just to give you a few examples, this is definitely not a complete list. It would have been way too long to describe all the outbreaks that happens in the 21st century, but maybe to name a few of them, I on purpose listed a few of them that were before the pandemic and a few of them that happened also after. So this is only considering the 21st century that did kind of start with an outbreak of another coronavirus, SARS, the first one that happened between 2022 and 24. That was an international type of outbreak with fairly limited number of cases, a fairly limited number of deaths, even though it's always too much. But the virus had back then fatality rate of about 10%. It still had like a major impact on economics and some health systems locally. In 2009, we have the swine flu pandemic that was, I mean, as self-explanatory with the word pandemic, it was global. It's very difficult to know how many cases actually happened at that moment, but it has been modeled that probably 700 million to 1.4 billion of people were infected back then. And it may have resulted in up to 600K death. Was fairly low fatality rate, but that's also one of the characteristics of the pandemic-prone pathogen. Then in 2012, emergence of another coronavirus, MERS. In that case, the outbreak was international again. There was again a fairly limited number of cases and deaths. The fatality rate of this one is pretty high, with 30% at least. So in 10 years, 2 coronaviruses had already emerged. You may also remember in 2014 and 2016, the outbreak of Ebola virus disease in West Africa. That's the largest outbreak that was ever recorded, with at least 28,000 cases and at least 11,000 deaths. So that's also an extremely high fatality rate of 40%. And that's one of the events that actually triggered the generation and creation of CEPI. So again, largest outbreak. For the 3 first outbreaks, it was always new viruses or new strain. Then comes 2019 with the COVID-19 pandemic. We are all very much aware of what happened there, with at least 760 million cases, almost 7 million deaths. And after that, things did not just stop, obviously. So we are still in the COVID-19 pandemic. This is basically seasonal now, but there are still some fairly significant outbreaks that are happening now. So in 2022, if you remember, there was a multi-country outbreak of Mpox, sorry, but with about 86,000 cases worldwide, with most of them happening in non-endemic countries. There was also a very limited number of deaths in that case, but that's also because Mpox was already known, so there were already some measures known for the management of the disease. Just to give you kind of an idea of what's going on with Mpox in Africa. So what happened as a multi-country outbreak actually is not that unfamiliar for African countries, because, for example, in DRC in 2020, there was already a monkeypox outbreak with way fewer cases, but more deaths already. So there was also like a fairly, there were some discrepancies in the management of the disease and the perception of the disease depending on what happened. And then 2 last examples with Marburg virus disease. those are very local and limited events, but I just wanted to mention them because Marburg virus in Equatorial Guinea and Tanzania, it's actually never happened before that there was any outbreak of that virus in those countries. So basically what I want to, the take-home message here is that there is a constant emergence of new viruses, geographical spread of pathogens that are already known, and also an increase in frequency of those outbreaks, sometimes epidemics and rarely pandemics. So when we go back to the COVID-19 pandemic itself, other also infectious diseases could be listed as lacking those elements that I've listed here. What happened and what went fairly wrong when the COVID-19 pandemic happened was an insufficient preparedness and response systemic capabilities for disease outbreak to deal with a pandemic. So mostly, and because we are research infrastructures, I kind of focused on also what happened in research and development. And there's always been, or at least it's been a long time, that there was an insufficient research and development investment and planning for all those elements listed here: vaccine development and manufacture, broad spectrum antivirals, targeted therapeutics, public health measures that are appropriate for the disease, sharing sequences and information, and sharing also limited medical countermeasures across countries. So in the end, and based on that observation that research and development is not necessarily sufficiently prepared to deal with a pandemic or an outbreak, let's say, we came with the idea that what we would need is an instrument that would offer capacities to deal with an outbreak, to increase, to allow disease control or to increase preparedness if necessary. So basically, I've just listed like those different steps that are in the research and development pipeline that starts with pathogen isolation and identification, pathogen characterization, also some work. It can be also related to vector-borne diseases. So that would mean that we need to characterize also target host factors and vectors, assay development. Of course, one of the major research and development endeavor would be around the development of medical countermeasures such as diagnostic, vaccine, drug, and also vector control measures and development. So the idea would be to always be ready to develop medical, veterinary, vector control countermeasures, and also not to forget about social sciences so that we can also develop behavioral measures that were like so critical during the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, very important, there should always be also some capacities to develop critical tools, methods, and reagents so that we are truly prepared to any outbreak. And so that was basically the concept of the ISIDORe project when we started preparing it. So ISIDORe is one of the ERA's first cornerstones. It was the result of the ERA incubator call for expression of interest in 2021. This is a 3-year project with a budget of 21 million euro. We have about 150 partners coming from 32 countries, as already mentioned by Jonathan, and we are offering hundreds of different services. So this was a response to the call dedicated to research infrastructure services for rapid research response to COVID-19 and other infectious disease epidemics, sorry. As already also mentioned by Jonathan, ERINHA is the coordinator of ISIDORe. We are a nonprofit international association with 10 members in Europe currently. We are dedicated to the study of highly pathogenic microorganisms, and our mission is to increase the understanding of infectious diseases, mostly those caused by highly pathogenic agents and those that require the use of high containment facilities. We're also interested in the preclinical development and assessment of medical countermeasures, and our priority pathogens, the pathogens that we are most interested in, are those that come from the WHO R&D blueprint list, meaning Ebola virus, Marburg virus, Lassa, Nipah, CCHF, SARS-CoV-2, etc. Anything basically that is pandemic or epidemic prone. We are in that very big endeavor accompanied by a number of research infrastructures. So that's what I call the core of ISIDORe. the research infrastructures of the S3 roadmap, the S3 landmarks, as well as some networks. So we are 16 European research infrastructure and 1 national surveillance network, Emergen. So we have Instruct, EU OpenScreen, Transvac, InfoVac2, Eurobioimaging, ECRIN, EVG, VetBionet, InfoFrontier, EMBRC, EATRIS, Elixir, BBMRI, MIRI, and Sonar Global. I take that opportunity to list them all because they have been, of course, crucial in the development of the work. Just as a reminder also for those of you that are not necessarily all too familiar with the concept of research infrastructure as defined by the European Commission, research infrastructure are facilities, resources, and services that are made available to research communities to conduct research and foster innovation in their field. So that's the mission of all those research infrastructure in their different field of expertise. What those research infrastructure allowed us to do is to build a very comprehensive catalog of services to be made available to scientific communities. So, for example, Instruct and Eurobioimaging with others are leading a category of services that we call analytical services. We have cell models, in vivo models, immunomonitoring and profiling, support for diagnostic and therapeutic development. So you can see on the screen all the leading research infrastructure for each of those categories. We have the support for vaccine development, the provision of clinical samples, provision of regulatory advice, trial preparation, and access to clinical trials, as well as social sciences and epidemiology. So all of this is made available for free to research communities through the ISIDORe project. What we do exactly is providing free access to our services through something that is called transnational access. So again, for those of you that are not super familiar with the concept, usually when there is a call for proposal, researchers, PIs would apply, and the funding would apply to that call, prepare a proposal, and if selected, the funding would be provided directly to those researchers, and then the PI and or the consortium conducts the research. In the case of transnational access, we also launch call for proposal quite similarly, but for those that are selected, then the funding, what the researchers are actually requesting in that case is an access to certain capacities, to certain services, so that research infrastructure would conduct the work for them. So the funding is provided to the research infrastructure, and the research infrastructure provides the selected researcher with free of charge access to services. So that's the main difference between the usual funding model and transnational access. So the way we work to provide that free access to our research infrastructure services, so we have the help of a strategic advisory board that advises us as a project for designing and launching calls for proposals that are all dedicated to pathogens of interest. So that started with SARS-CoV-2, then we had some Mpox work, and I will explain further where we are at now. And scientific communities are invited to apply to those calls for proposal. It happens the same way as any other type of call for proposal. We have an independent peer review process to evaluate those applications, and those that are selected are then implemented by the ISIDORe partner facilities, those dozens of partners that we have gathered due to their specific capacities. And then, so the selected researchers get free of charge transnational access to our services. The scientific strategy of ISIDORe and the transnational access program is designed thanks to the recommendation of a number of entities that we have gathered in our strategic advisory board. And we are very grateful to them because they have been very helpful for that first year of ISIDORe, because everything needed to be implemented fairly quickly during that first year. So we have the European Commission as an observer, as well as WHO. We have also representative of HERA, the ECDC, EMA, CEPI, GLOPID-R, WOAH, sorry, FAO, and FPIA. This is an old slide. I should have changed the name of OIE. That became WOAH now. So we have two modes of functioning, let's say, or two types of program. We have research response programs, sorry, And in that case, the idea is to provide an answer to immediate needs in epidemic management. So in that response type of program, we have already covered SARS-CoV-2. The call for proposal is now closed, and we have also covered Mpox, and the calls are now closed too. The idea here, the goal is to help control public health emergencies. Additionally, we are also convinced that there is a very strong need, a crucial need for more preparedness, being more ready to any new outbreaks in the future. So we have launched a preparedness program, and in that case, as we are saying on the website, anticipation avoids escalation. So the idea is to already perform some research on some very specific pathogens that are known for the epidemic or pandemic potential, so that we are better prepared should something happen. So we have currently, and they are still open, and you can find them on the website on ISIDORE project.eu. We have a call for proposal for risk group 4 pathogen that gathers Ebola, Marburg virus, Nipah, CCHF, and all the different pathogens and priorities are listed on the website. We have also a call for proposal for vector-borne pathogens and their vectors, respiratory pathogen, and other pandemic-prone pathogen that includes orthopox viruses and enteroviruses. So just to give you an idea, I'm not going to list them all here, but those are the pathogens that have been prioritized by the Strategic Advisory Board. So there are a few limitations in the nature of the project that can be submitted to us, but basically, if you do work on one of those pathogens, we would be happy to receive your applications. Finally, and I'm almost there, so the ambition of ISIDORE is really to support scientists. We are kind of a support action that aims to advance user project with research infrastructure services and all those capacities that are offered in the European research area to the scientific communities, and achieve also, hopefully, an unprecedented level of synergies between the different research infrastructures that we have gathered. We are also very interested and dedicated to favor open science and data sharing. This is something that we work on. We will use global standards and common data platform. For that, we are supported by the Buy COVID project that will be presented later today, this morning. And hopefully we will become a stable instrument in the era for addressing infectious disease related research in times of preparedness and emergencies. So today is the first annual meeting of the ISIDORE project, and the way we wanted to address that and approach that is to wonder the current landscape that ISIDORE belongs to. So that's what you're going to see this morning with the different presentation of our external speakers and guests. What has ISIDORE achieved in its first year? That's going to be this afternoon, and tomorrow morning the agenda will be dedicated to what ISIDORE aims to achieve next. So that's it for me for now. Thank you for your attention. And
thank you very much. Thank you, Audrey. So we do have a minute for a quick question, if anybody has an urgent question for Audrey. Otherwise, we'll pass straight on to Wolfgang Philipp. So we're very pleased to welcome you here. So Wolfgang is deputy head of HERA, and he's going to tell us about HERA.
To specify, founding deputy head of HERA. We are a dynamic organization, and we are restructuring a little bit and expanding as well. So first of all, many thanks for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be here. We have Christian Wimmer, who is on the scientific advisory board of ISIDORE, so that is a huge asset. Oh, it's okay. That's fine. That's fine. I mean, I can continue to entertain you with a couple of anecdotes about the pandemic. First of all, I mean, it's certainly the first meeting space during the pandemic where I am, where I could also wear sunglasses. That is already something very nice. No? So the second point is it's obviously very, very nice to have such a dedicated group. across all the relevant disciplines to contribute to pandemic preparedness in the future in a better way. So I wanted to give you a quick overview, Audrey. I mean, you gave an overview of what's happening in the world and what's happening with ISIDORE and where you stand, what the plans are, and what the services are that you offer. Just to come back to really the very first beginning of the pandemic, we saw, and at the time I was still in Luxembourg at a unit, running the unit for crisis management and preparedness in health. Sounds great. We did preparedness work before the pandemic came, obviously based on lessons learned from the past pandemics, Ebola, Zika, influenza, you name it, down to SARS. There were a lot of reports, a lot of lessons learned, a lot of points that would need to be changed. And many things were changed, obviously, over the past 2 decades, but not everything. And what we saw was that there is obviously a huge discrepancy between preparedness plans on paper and preparedness plans in reality. No? So the keyword is really about implementation, and the keyword is also about coordination. That requires, obviously, the will to be part of a coordinated circle, and that is what we, at least at the Commission, try to do with the member states. So it all started on now about COVID. It started on the 9th of January. We posted, we have an early warning response system at the EU level where we posted an alarm. So it's a notification about an unknown disease with a potential across of a certain potential. 15th of January, we had the first meeting with member states. And obviously, what is the first question you ask the member states? Do you have enough PPE? Because I mean, we knew it was it was transmissible between from human to human. There was a certain dynamic. Information level was quite obscure, not really there. So first question, PPE. Apart from 4 countries, all countries said yes. So and then you all remember what happened afterwards. The same around availability of vaccine, of therapeutics, of diagnostics. It was all a big, let's say, black hole, I must say. So the EU has developed then vaccine strategy, did jointly procured and assured access to vaccines, to large portfolio of vaccines that actually saved us at the end of the day. And we saw that many things were absolutely not working as it was put on paper. That's a simple matter of fact. One of the things, apart from the non-availability of PPE, was, as I said, diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines. We proposed then during the spring, summer, at Commission level to create something like BARDA. I mean, that was the first idea, a BARDA-like agency. That's how Commission President von der Leyen expressed it in her first State of the Union speech in September 2020. And that was obviously the political side. You know, you put it out in a room, and then somebody has to work on it and create it. And that happened then in, I must say, or at least that's what people outside say. In 1 year, we created HERA, and we had it operational and running 1st of October 2021 as a commission service. So we are same commission service like RNI or JRC or many others. The reason why it was a commission service, or why it was created as a commission service, is manifold, but it has to do, first of all, it's much faster to do it in this way, and secondly, also we had access to budgets. Our budgets were earmarked for HERA, 6 billion euros. That sounds like a huge amount, but we could avoid discussions with member states about generating fresh budget, which was at the time certainly not the most appropriate discussion. So we were created in 2021. We were created, so as compared to BARDA, a bit broader. We saw some shortcomings also in epidemic intelligence, in modeling and forecasting. We saw some shortcomings in, let's say, in a consolidated research agenda when it comes to pandemic preparedness, and so on and so forth. So we thought, let's create something that really starts from the detection of signals, the assessment of these signals, and then you would need to see here a question mark, you know, kind of a decision tree. Do we have appropriate medical countermeasures somewhere on the shelf, or something that can be modified or repurposed, or don't we have anything? And if we need something, then we need to invest into research, we need to invest into the development in particular, and then production and so on and so forth. So the whole value chain is end to end. I mean, that is so fashionable these days. Everybody is working end to end, but we are really trying to do it. Really down to the deployment of certain stocks of relevant medical countermeasures. So that's the idea of HERA. That is our basic mission, to make sure that medical countermeasures are available, or that we create means during preparedness time, so during now, the remaining 62% of our lifespan where we are not hit by a pandemic, to make sure that that we have available technologies, that we have prototype vaccines, that we have an idea or more investment into the development of broadband antivirals and so on and so forth. So that is the whole idea of HERA, nothing else. It is not about policy. It is really something practical and pragmatic, I would say. We started with a couple of people, 6, 7 people at the beginning, and then we recruited a lot more during the year. Now we are about 85 from different disciplines, everything from, let's say, biochemists to political scientists. We don't have translators this time, but we have employed a lot of people that are coming from outside, but as well from inside the Commission. So people that want to do something else and really work on a pragmatic development of an entity that would make, hopefully, in the future a difference. And the whole approach was not just coming out and creating HERA as a BARDA-like entity or agency. The idea was also to reinforce the legal base where we have seen shortcomings as well. No? So that is for the European Medicines Agency, in particular when it comes to organization of clinical trials and so on and so forth. So that is one part. More importantly for us now is, not more importantly, but equally important for us, obviously as well, to change and to reinforce the mandate of the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control. So to have a better intelligence function there, and to have more modelers and so on and so forth. So wherever we had seen shortcomings during the pandemic in providing recommendations for response, and not just options for response, but real recommendations for response, these functions were strengthened in terms of legal base, and then also through a piece of legislation on coordination of in response to preparedness in response to cross-border health threats. A new regulation was set out, basically reinforcing the legal base that we had before, because we've seen, I mean, the legal base we had before already was calling for a coordinated response. It was calling for coordination in terms of preparedness between member states. And as I said at the beginning, the whole thing did not really function. Not because it was not on paper, simply because you have a certain stress situation, and then things move differently as in the training or as in a theoretical iteration. So the whole thing is a huge package which is called the European Health Union, which is bringing for the first time really together different elements that should work together. No? So it's not about creating redundancies or duplications, but really collaboration between the different entities, EMA, ECDC, some other agencies, HERA, DG Research, and so on and so forth. So all DG Grow when it comes to manufacturing capacities and so on and so forth. So HERA, I'm sure Christian has presented this already in last meeting. I mean, we have 2 different modes to work. One is the preparedness part. You see the different activities here. All of this is not just done at the European level. We also try to reach out, or we are reaching out to third countries with the US. In Japan, SCADA, they have a vaccine development program, Singapore, Korea, some other countries, but also African agencies and countries are a part of the reach out. Here again, to have a collaboration at international level. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to pragmatic response, what you don't want to have is a kind of a real competition between countries for medical countermeasures, as we have seen it, plus for simple items that might hinder the development and the production, timely production of vaccines, as we have seen it as well, or diagnostics or other relevant points. The new thing here is, or the new element is that we have an emergency framework now. So once, so under the new legislation, the EU can declare the public health emergency. Theoretically, we were already able to do this before, but I mean, now it's very clear. And that would then trigger, it can also be the WHO. Obviously, we want to have a declaration by WHO, a timely declaration by WHO at the end of the day, at least of a FIC, or public health emergency of international concern. But we could do it, and that would simply trigger the response very quickly. The most important elements here are the activation of emergency funding. So this time we had the emergency support instrument. That was an empty budget line, basically, that was filled up with a lot of money from different areas that was available. And that money was mostly used for the reservation contracts that we had for the vaccines. But under the new framework, there is a possibility to activate quickly emergency funding. That's one thing. And the second thing is, which is important, is the HERA crisis board. Here we would have, let's say, at least from the commission level, for example, the commissioner or commission president to be seen, to be decided. But from the member states, an executive decision maker, either politician or whoever has the power to take decisions quickly, would part that with the commission that has crisis board. The idea is simply to take decisions quickly, not to wait for the next council meeting or for a next meeting of health ministers, then need to go back to the finance ministers and to, so this is really something that is structured to be fast and take decisions based on scientific advice or whatever kind of advice that is available. So these are, in my eyes, the most important parts here. We also have possibility to activate manufacturing of vaccines. At the moment, we are in the making, in the signing of contracts for that, and a couple of other things. So including as well activation of research to be part of a very specific and targeted response mechanism. So this is just a couple of elements showing you what we have been doing the first year, not just setting up our internal structures and stuff, but there were a couple of things, like, for example, we're investing into investing. We have earmarked money under 3 different programs. One is the Horizon Europe, one is the EU for Health, the health program, which had been massively pumped up by a factor of 10 as compared to before. And then RescEU, that is a mechanism under the Union Civil Protection Mechanism that can be used to create stockpiles and deploy medical countermeasures or response items, basically, in case of an emergency or upon request of a country. So that is relatively helpful. We have been using that, or we have been using this to establish stockpiles. I mentioned already a couple of these things. In 2023, we continued, obviously, with activities across the board. It's not just the 5 things mentioned here, but importantly is important is certainly the investments through Horizon Europe, for example, for development of vaccines, broad spectrum antivirals, but also diagnostics. That's an area that is a little bit, that's always a little bit falling off the table when discussing about preparedness activities for the future. Perhaps not in a research community, but I can tell you in the public health community, it is really, let's say, always the little brother of the big boys. So, but what we are doing as well is, I mentioned already, establishing stockpiles, and these stockpiles, the first round was published last year, in particular for the medical countermeasures in response to CBRN events, potential CBRN events. And this year, we just in March published a new call with DG ECHO, so the Humanitarian Aid Director General, for medical countermeasures in a broader sense. No? So medicines, antibiotics, antidotes, antivirals, whatever's on the market, and that was obviously done with the member states. But just to give you an impression, 1.2 billion euros are going into these stockpiles. And that comes with a lot of problems afterwards. It's not just buying stuff or reserving stuff and putting it on the shelf or having access to it. It's also a matter on how to manage these stockpiles. It's highly complex and very often underestimated, including the strategies for deployment, because it doesn't help you. You have something sitting in Paris and you need it somewhere else. So it's quite complex, but we're also looking into additional possibilities to fund development of medical countermeasures. So what we call HERA Invest is basically a new facility under EU Invest. So that's done with the EIB. We are putting 100 million euros there. That's for co-funding. We also tried to attract, obviously, private capital into these to support the development of to support the final development of late-stage developed medical countermeasures. But that's done through the EIB. We are financing this with 100 million, I said, and then obviously we're working on our platform just to show you a little bit on how the money is spent. That's a bit boring, but at the end of the day, what you see is that, let's say, from Horizon Europe, we are reaching next year plateau with about 200 million a year. But the funding opportunities under EU for Health are going up massively towards the end of the program, at least the end of the multi-annual financial program. And that program, this EU for Health offers, is a bit more flexible when it comes. We can also use it for procurements, for many kind of tenders. So that gives us really a bit more flexibility. You see here simply a couple of figures on the investments, on the spendings in the first 1.5, 2 years. I mentioned already stockpiling with 1.2 billion, and then investments into prevention, diagnosis, treatment. That is basically what we're trying to do. So we are going to continue. Obviously, we are not going to stop now and say we just repeat what we have been doing the first 1.5 years. What we want to have is an entity that has all the processes in place, because at the end of the day, we need to be responsive. That's the job of HERA. So we're not looking too much. We are looking obviously also in the whole chain of research and development or innovation, but we are very much interested in the late stage of that value chain. We're investing also in our intelligence functions, like for example, through wastewater surveillance. A lot of money is going into this, and we are in discussions to establish this at a global level with some other players to have, let's say, relevant information basically floating in, ideally in real time. I mean, that can be done through some strategic arrangements that is under discussion. We are also obviously looking into the further development of vaccines, of prototypes, of compounds, of technologies, whatever is there and could be deployed or could be further developed also in times of crisis. So that's the idea behind clinical trials networks. That is something that's a discussion going on, obviously with EMA and with colleagues from DG Santé and also of the member states, because the power here is very much in the camp of the member states. But nevertheless, what we need to have at the end of the day is a network that can be rapidly deployed and rapidly used, which is warm, where protocols are there, where structures are agreed, and where also the excellence and the expertise is there, and to overcome a little bit the fragmentation that we see very much, not just in this area, but in many other areas as well. But in this area, it's very evident. And then I stop here. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Wolfgang. So perfectly on time. Our next speaker, unfortunately, is not able to be with us in person. So Hervé Raoul is online. And it's a particular pleasure to introduce Hervé. Those of you who are involved in the putting ISIDORE together will know that at the time Hervé was the Director General of ERINHA. And so he formerly was the coordinator of the project proposal. Hervé, I hope you can hear us.
Yeah, very nice.
Good. So what I suggest is when you wish to change slides, you say next slide and we'll do it for you. So
I will try to do so. Thanks a lot, Jonathan, for this kind introduction. And thanks for inviting me to give a talk about Be Ready. So just to talk after Wolfgang will make the presentation easier and much more understandable by all the participants to the meeting. May I have the next one, please? So I will not repeat all what Wolfgang already said, but we have been facing a specific context, and the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that there were things that did not work when we are facing a new crisis related to an infectious pathogens. So, of course, it has shown that fragmentation is an issue, but I think, as Wolfgang already mentioned, it is not the only issue, because we have realized that we were missing lots of countermeasures that were not available. We were missing lots of scientific data that were not there. And we believe that now we have to learn from this. And probably, I think the COVID-19 has made the thing moving on, but we already learned lots of things during the former pandemics, epidemics. Of course, I have in mind the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, but then Zika, and now the COVID. The Monkeypox, more recently, has also shown that we need to be more prepared. So Be Ready is there to prepare a future European partnership dedicated to pandemic preparedness. And we will try to improve the European Union's preparedness to predict and respond to emerging infectious disease health threat. The idea is, of course, to be in position to better coordinate the future fundings, but also to harmonize the view and the vision of the different countries and member states in the European Union. We will, of course, to try to build and to continue to build on existing pandemic preparedness networks and research infrastructure. And I think, by the way, to be present here for the annual meeting of ISIDORE, of course, makes sense. And of course, it is of main importance that we will have to be in clear and transparent synergy with the HERA. I think now you can understand the reason why after the presentation of Wolfgang. May I have the next one, please? Okay, so Be Ready is a CSA, and the objectives are quite clear. Of course, the first one is to be in position to engage all the partners in the European Union to work and to participate to the future partnership. It is something of main importance. And I think the core of this activity will be around the development of an innovative and visionary strategic research and innovation agenda that will have to be cross-cutting, interdisciplinary, and of course, take into account the One Health approach. We will have, of course, afterwards to consolidate the future partnership after this first phase. But as I mentioned, we will have also to ensure complementarities and transparency and coordination with HERA, but also the other entities at the European Commission, to involve all the relevant stakeholders. And I already mentioned that we will have to be in close contact and take into account the vision and the strategy of other initiatives. So we are thinking, of course, to GLOPIDER, to WHO, to ACT accelerators, the G7, G20, health working groups, but also I think ISIDORE will be among the targets that will have to be involved in our developments. And the other things, it is an important point that we will have also to try to raise the awareness of the importance to increase pandemic preparedness, but I think at the present time is not the most complicated task. May I have the next one, please? So just to understand what Be Ready means, so it is for building a European strategic research and innovation area in direct synergy with others EU and international initiatives for pandemic preparedness. So Be Ready. We have a budget of 2 million euros for 3 years. It is a coordination and support action. And at the present time, we have 15 countries, European countries and associated countries involved in that represent around 25 partners at the present time. And the coordination is ensured by the agency where I'm now, so the INRS, Emerging Infectious Disease. May I have the next one? So the CSA is articulated around 3 main pillars. So the first one will be dedicated to the building of the partnership itself with 2 work packages. The first one dedicated to management and secretariat, it is quite classical. And the work package 2 will be dedicated to the development of the draft proposal for the creation of the partnership. The second pillar, that is of course probably the most important in terms of health and science and research, will be split into 2 different work packages. So the first one that will be dedicated to research and health, and the second one, the work package 4, more oriented to health, biotech, research and innovation. And the last pillar will be dedicated to synergies and engagement. So of course, there is a specific work package dedicated to the cooperation with HERA itself. And the work package 6 will be dedicated to the synergy with European Union and international alignment with the different initiatives I already talked about. And the last one, of course, that is important, will be dedicated to dissemination and communication. May I have the next one, please? So if we make a short focus on the strategic research and innovation agenda, so as I mentioned, there will be 2 main axes that will lead at the end to a unique document, of course. And we will take into account 2 time frames, but I think it was also already commented by Wolfgang. So the first time frame will be dedicated down during the inter-epidemic period, where that is more classically called peaceful time. Where we will have to prepare the response to future crises. And I think we have lots of work to do in this field. And we have seen that we are not enough prepared when a crisis arrives. So it is something of main importance. And the second time frame will be focusing on the crisis phase itself. And but during also inter-epidemic period, we have to prepare the response we will try to adopt at that time. So it is a work that will be also done and clearly documented in the frame of the 3A. It will focus on research and innovation, and I think it's something very important to keep in mind because lots of people consider that preparedness concerns also the capacity to take in charge the patients and to introduce and to prepare the surveillance activities, etc. But Be Ready is clearly dedicated to the research aspect, and this will be clearly done in coordination with European and international actors. So ERA I already mentioned, but DG RTD is closely involved also to our work. DG Santé, ECDC, EMA, and others will be associated to the work. At the end of this CSA, of course, a consultation of member states and associated countries will be organized to be in position to move to the implementation of the partnership itself. May I have the next one, please? So how we plan to proceed or already have proceeded. So we have, of course, performed a gap a kind of gap analysis to try to identify the research gap, the obstacle, the weaknesses, etc., for the valuable development of an appropriate preparedness and response to the pandemics. So these are already been done, and it will be the basis, I think, of the 3A itself. We organized a lot of workshops to discuss on the priorities that should be included in the 3A itself. We have created an expert group because some of the representatives of the partners were not pure scientists. So we have created an expert group that will be in position to make some proposals concerning the priorities. And this is done associated closely representatives of the different European institutions. A stakeholder consultative workshop will be organized, and probably not only one. So an interview will be organized also. So I think in this frame, ISIDORE will be associated to that. And of course, a public consultation at the end will be performed. May I have the next one, please? So here you have a view of what is the table of contents of the actual draft of 3A. And so I think it's quite classical. And if I may have the next slide, please, just to have a focus. So we have already developed and made some proposals to clearly identify what should be the priorities of action. So the first one that has been identified is to be in position to accelerate the knowledge concerning the potential disease associated to infectious pathogens, because many things are missing at the present time. And this acquirement of knowledge will lead also to identification of innovative countermeasures that should be developed. The priority number 2 will be, of course, to be in position to boost health innovation and to push the discovery performed and obtained in the frame of the priority 1 to the flow of development, and it is something very important. As I mentioned, also the priority 3 will be dedicated to the preparation for the management of research during a crisis, and I think that's an important time. I hope in the future we won't have to test again the hydroxychloroquine against viruses. Of course, the fourth priority will focus on the reinforcement of the infrastructures and networks. It is something of main importance. These infrastructures already exist, as well as the networks, so we have to take advantage and to include them in the global strategy. And of course, something will be dedicated to training, education, and communication, which looks as very important. May you have the next one, please? So the agenda for the development of this CSA, called Be Ready, we will be in position by I think the end of next month to propose the first draft for the partnership, as well as the first draft for the 3A itself. By the middle of this year, we shall have a final proposal for the partnership itself, as well as for the 3A. And by the mid of next year, the agenda should be finalized and adopted by the different future members of the partnership itself. And of course, the year after, we will plan to move to the adoption of the work program, including the calls related to the partnership. May I have the next one, please? So that's it. I put there the contact. If you have any question in the future, you can try to contact me or Laurent Jabeuf, who is the project manager of Be Ready itself. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Hervé. So that was a very useful information, I think, for everybody here who's perhaps not so familiar with what Europe is doing in the field of pandemic preparedness. What I suggest, Hervé, if you're able to stay online with us, is that we go straight on to Dominique's talk And then perhaps if there's time for questions afterwards, we will have them together for questions for Dominique, for you, and for Wolfgang. So it's a pleasure to introduce Dominique Sobczak, if I said that correctly, Deputy Head of DG RTD Unit.
Okay, thank you. Well, just to be precise, we have in DG RTD, we have many units, and I'm the Deputy Head of Unit for one of them, called Research and Innovation Actors and Research Careers, which now for 2 years has a responsibility also for research infrastructures. And I'm Dominique Sobczak, and I know that Polish pronunciation is not the easiest one you can imagine. All right, so after all these practical presentations, I'm worried I cannot tell you really anything interesting. But what I would like to share with you is some thoughts on how your activities and the research infrastructures that are constructing these activities and the ISIDORe initiative altogether, how they fit in the broader thinking that we have around research infrastructures, their development, and their role in crisis preparedness, but more broadly also actually in addressing societal challenges. So basically, okay, no, I will try this way. I think it will be easier to have a look what I put on the slides. So that what I say is more or less consistent with what you see on the screen. So basically, when we think about research infrastructures and we think about how they contribute to the preparedness and crisis response, I think from our side, we take a broader perspective. So of course, you're involved in one particular issue, or issues related to infectious diseases and their outbreaks. But when we look at it from the point of view of the broader research infrastructures policy, of course, we have the entire landscape of research infrastructures for all the scientific fields. So thinking about the development of the research infrastructures capacity, we take a significantly broader perspective. So first of all, it needs to be recognized that research infrastructures are actually relevant for crisis at different levels. First of all, you can see some sudden emergencies, like health-related one that you have been all exposed to, and we have been all exposed to, where the research infrastructures can provide quick response, diagnostic tools, services to try to find treatments, new techniques, or vaccines, or long-term, also looking at the long-term consequences of what's happening. But also some research infrastructures are relevant in the situations of natural disasters. I mean, we just had earthquakes in Turkey, and there are research infrastructures that are relevant for that, and they could actually help save lives because they can monitor what's happening, they can send warning signals, and they can help the authorities to prepare the society, the community for what's going to happen. And that is some examples are, of course, as I mentioned, the seismic activities, but also volcano eruptions or floods, etc. So we need to take that into account as well. Now, however, we need to see that in the longer run. And I think that the message that is quite clear from especially the COVID pandemic, but also all the discussion around climate change and addressing the climate change, is that we need to take care of the long-term capacities that we have in order to address the challenges so that we can cope with emergency situations if they arise and address these challenges in the longer run. And this is essential because if we had not started building up European capacities in ARISE 20 years ago, we would not be able to do what we still managed to do relatively effectively, even though problems, of course, were there with the COVID-19, but also in different other situations where research infrastructures can react quite quickly, can provide services immediately by flexibly adapting to the needs of scientists. That would not be possible. So if we only start thinking about it when this happens, then we are very late because we can only actually address challenges sometime in the future. Because as all of you know, research infrastructures take some time to develop their capacities. So in the longer term challenges, that can potentially lead to different crisis situations and emergencies. I would just mention things like climate change or biodiversity loss, or the fact that we are facing shortage of certain raw materials, or now we are speaking about the energy crisis. Actually, for all those issues, research infrastructures, when we look at the broad landscape, going from particle physics to humanities, they can provide important information, they can provide important services for science to be able to respond to what's going on. So the key issues, as I said, really the biggest issue is building the long-term capacity and having a strategy that we would pursue in the longer run, underpinned by smart policy and funding, in order to be able to address those challenges and crises or emergencies in the longer run in the more effective way. What we see is that in immediate terms, but I will come back to this a bit later, among the lessons learned that we've seen from the COVID-19 for the broad landscape of RIs, is that it is necessary to develop this capacity in such a way that they can actually be flexible. And they can be flexible as research infrastructures to adapt their services, but also on the side of policy and funding, we need to be flexible to be able to react and facilitate the work of research infrastructures to help us address these challenges. But it's actually, we all suffered, many people suffered, as you saw the statistics from Audrey, many people suffered, many people died with COVID-19, and that's of course very sad. And I don't want to be cynical, but actually both the visibility of the COVID-19 and also the visibility of climate change are actually good news for science, because science made it to the headlines. And many people that were not so interested in what's going on started being interested and started seeing relevance of developing long-term scientific capacities and making sure that we don't undermine that by more short-termistic solutions or approaches or priorities. Now, I would, okay, the sun is not helping me because that I don't know by heart. So you will need to bear with me that I will be walking a little bit here. And in the spirit of that, we've also seen some political recognition, quite visible political recognition of the role of research infrastructures. And here I put some quotes from probably the most visible one, which are the Competitiveness Council conclusions under the Czech presidency in December last year. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the things that we are doing that are called like Competitiveness Council conclusions, but just to be very brief on that, as you know, the councils of ministers meet in different configurations. So we have a research configuration as well. And an important way in which we stimulate policy and which we stimulate development, funding, etc., and more operational work are the political guidelines that are formulated through so-called council conclusions, where all the member states agree on certain messages to pass. So under the leadership of the Czech presidency, there is actually a very long document. Well, for a council conclusion, it's very long because it's, I think, 6 or 7 pages of different messages recognizing the relevance of research infrastructures and passing some ideas of where are the focal points that we should look into to make sure that in the longer run we do have the proper research infrastructures capacity so that we can be a leading research area in the world. And I put here some quotes. I selected only those that really recognize the role of research infrastructures for challenges and for crises. I didn't put the ideas, and if you're welcome to read the council conclusions. They are not such terrible to read actually. And then you can see, because we are replying to that usually. So I will get to some of the things that we are doing also to address the messages passed in the council conclusions. So first of all, in one of the very first paragraphs, the councils or the ministers agreed among all the EU member states, recognize that a fully functional and operational European research infrastructure system plays a central role in Europe's ability to provide with knowledge-based solutions to grand societal challenges, to support overall EU priorities, and contributes to prosperity and well-being in Europe, which is a very general message, but it's an important one because it speaks about the relevance of RIs for the society in general and for addressing specific issues that we are facing. And then when you go into a little bit of the details, as I said, these are selected points, you see that they speak about the fact that we need to design new services based on different missions of RIs to support such policy objectives as green transition, digital transformation, but also resilience of the EU economy, sustainable development goals. And they made a significant contribution, and they appreciate the early reaction of RIs at different levels, European, national, regional, to address the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. They welcome the fact that RIs adapted quickly to the new reality, continue to provide services for science, but also develop new services that are targeting specifically the issues related to the pandemic. Then they also speak about the need to be ready to accommodate to sudden crisis situations, and that research infrastructures and the research infrastructures ecosystem overall in Europe is a key component for the post-crisis recovery and has a great potential to strengthen the resilience and preparedness of the European society to cope with crises in the future. These are important messages because then they allow us, those who are more directly involved in facilitating your work as research infrastructures and facilitating the development of research infrastructures, to really do some concrete actions on the ground. Now, another area where you are slightly more familiar with probably is the European Strategy Forum on Research Infrastructures, and they also in the roadmap of 2021, where many of the RIs sitting in the room are very familiar with the roadmap, and you are on it for some years. They also recognized what the research infrastructures were doing in the pandemic. They provided an overview of examples and clear cases of how research infrastructures reacted, what they provided, what was the added value in different fields of science. And starting from understanding diagnosis and treatment for the COVID-19 pandemic, but also going through some RIs that develop some production capacity, for example, to produce masks or ventilators. We actually were able to identify even such cases of research infrastructures being engaged directly with that, or analysis of longer term consequences and societal responses to lockdown, to different restrictive measures related to social adaptation, well-being, and also longer term consequences, for example, on mental health, which are still significantly underestimated. So what ESRI did also very early in the pandemic in 2020, we very quickly, as a quick fix, we established a website where we gathered different types of services that appeared, that were set up by RIs. We wanted to have it in one place for RIs, both at European and national level. And many of your RIs have actually made entries there in the very early weeks, actually, of the lockdown. So, all right, now lessons learned at a more operational level. First of all, what we could see, we've had some discussions with RIs, including in the International Conference on Research Infrastructures in Brno, where some of you are present, that when we look at RI operations, because in the end, we also want to stimulate the fact that RIs can operate in the crisis situations. We wanted to have a look what it meant actually to be hit by COVID and all the restrictions for the operations of RIs. The effects were varied, as you can imagine, because RIs are very different. And that depended mainly, obviously, on the type of services that RIs provided and the way that they operate. If you have an RI that is fully digital and provides access to data, then of course the effect of such a pandemic is relatively small. If you're running an analytical facility which is subject to a lockdown, then in many cases these facilities were simply shut down because people could not, even employees could not come. We've had research infrastructures that have, for example, some animals that are alive, and then their lives need to be sustained. So there, only the staff that was sustaining the lives of animals was allowed, and all the rest was shut down. So what it revealed was actually that many RIs were not really prepared for that situation. It took them by surprise, and they were not sure how to react. They had to try to adapt. And some of the messages that we have from the discussions with these RIs on how to increase their preparedness so that they are actually ready for that kind of situations is that, first of all, the flexibility of access models and use of RIs in innovative ways need to be better developed to be able to switch kind of an emergency mode when that kind of situation arrives. That we need a better coordination both between, in the distributed RIs, both between the nodes of RIs and across RIs, and I'm sure that many of you have know that it is key to create an environment that enables effective sharing of data and also access to services, not only in the EU, but also across the world and also across different user groups. That in the situation where your services are impacted by an emergency situation, you need to keep contact with your user communities, because you need to develop together new ways of collaboration. And that for some RIs that relied largely on physical access, that remained a challenge for quite a long time and took them quite some time to adapt. Now, of course, many RIs that have had provided physical access, they moved to remote access or to fully virtual access. And that was an important innovation, but has its challenges and has its restrictions as well, and negative side effects. And one of the important information was also at the policy level, that research in general and research infrastructures in particular were actually not explicitly parts of crisis management plans. So they were left out of the bracket. They were a bit in a vacuum, in a regulatory vacuum. So on the one hand, they were essential and their services were important to address what's going on. On the other hand, they face significant challenges with operations because they were not covered by the kind of different exemptions that were offered to organizations which are essential for addressing the crisis. So now I'm actually getting slowly to the end. At what we do at the EU level, very, very briefly, I will not spend much time on that, to support RIs more generally. So at the kind of the broadest policy level, as you may know, we have the ERA policy agenda with 20 different actions. We have one action, number 8, which is directly addressing research infrastructures. And within that action, we have a set of activities. First of all, to stimulate better investments and more sustainable funding for the existing research infrastructures. Second of all, to find ways to have more inclusive and more sustainable access to research infrastructure. And I think what ISIDORe is doing is fantastic. It builds up on previous activities, and we are precisely trying to reflect on how to make sure that that kind of activities can be further maintained in the future. We also focus on increasing the impact of research infrastructures, but also the recognition of the impact of these investments on the economy and society. We have seen in the past that the research infrastructures world, let's say like this, suffered a little bit from the lack of proper marketing. We'll be very direct here. We've seen that in negotiations on the budget for Horizon Europe in comparison to Horizon 2020, we had very direct messages like, okay, no, the marketing of research infrastructures was not as strong as some other types of activities that were strengthened significantly. Well, the RI part was not strengthened financially at all, while the others were strengthened significantly in comparison to Horizon 2020. And we want, and you are part of that also already, as ISIDORe, we want to have more targeted priority setting focused on specific scientific and policy needs. Now, what we do at the level of ESFRI, and that actually translates a number of messages that were passed in the Czech Council conclusions, although we started working on these issues a little bit earlier than the Council conclusions themselves were formally adopted, is that within the ESFRI work plan of 22-23, we have a comprehensive set of analytical work. And many of you are exposed to information gathering that we are doing. I see people laughing. I know that you were filling the surveys, questionnaires, and well, we apologize for that. But we really want to spend this time right now. As you know, we've had roadmaps, 3 roadmaps in 2006, 2008, and 2010. Then another set of ESFRI roadmaps in 2016, 18, and 21. And now we want to spend time to understand what's going on. I mean, just putting it very simply, across a number of dimensions, so that we can, first of all, do better support in the future and to do it in a smarter way, but also to build up a case for research infrastructures for future discussions also on funding, on how we approach the development, further development of RIs in Europe. So some of the topics that ESFRI, in collaboration with the Commission, because we are part of ESFRI, we are actually part of working on all these elements that we are doing, is first of all, okay, we started the monitoring of ESFRI landmarks, so we look at the performance of research infrastructures that are operational. What we are preparing a new type of landscape analysis, not describing necessarily only what exists, but actually looking at what the scientific needs in the longer run are and will be, and what kind of service gaps may exist in Europe to be able to make more strategic choices about investment in the future. We look at RI impact more operationally. So what are the ways to identify impacts? What are the methodologies and how we can improve that? We look at RI funding models, a very important part of the work, because with that, we want to understand better the funding landscape. And believe it or not, no one really understands the funding landscape for RIs. The member states don't, the regions don't, the Commission doesn't, because there is so much diversity of information. Some RIs have multiple funding sources in such ways that are not easy to gather it in a kind of informative way. So we are trying to do this. We are trying to do this to understand how this works. So we are trying to do this to understand what the gaps are and how we can better make sure that all this funding which is available can work in synergy and how we can increase its volume. And what we are doing with that as well, those of you who have seen the questionnaire or filled it up already, know that we also ask the RIs to identify their investment needs for the next decade. And this is part of our attempt to build up a strong case for the necessity of research infrastructures investments to really understand what are the investment needs in the RI community for the next year, so we can better adapt the funding that is available or could be made available. We look at industrial cooperation as an important component also for activities of some research infrastructures. We look at international cooperation, which is a growing opportunity for European research infrastructures for engagement with global partners. And we have a growing number of examples where European RIs are right now ready and willing to engage in these international collaborations. We've done contributions to industrial technology roadmaps. There's as you know, there is an European industrial strategy that was published. Within that, there are some industrial technology roadmaps that will be prepared or are being prepared. We want the RIs to be able to contribute to these, the implementation of these roadmaps, and to RI services to be taken into account when it is considered how the development of the different sectors will be going on. So we've provided some contributions to that. More recently, well, all this is actually ongoing, but one thing that we did in a bit of a crisis mode was to look at the impact of the energy crisis and the Russian war on Ukraine with respect to the availability of essential components or raw materials or compounds that are needed for RIs to function and for certain experiments to be done. So we are providing some recommendations on that as well. I want to strengthen more broadly the stakeholder engagement. Now, final slide, what we do under Horizon Europe. Well, we try to have a holistic approach. I will not go through all these different points. Holistic approach to the development of RIs. And the big difference from Horizon 2020 to Horizon Europe is that we have implemented a much more challenge-driven approach, not only to the provision of services, but also to the development of RIs. So the lens of challenges and the lens also of crisis preparedness is actually an important part of the way that we look at funding for RIs. And we have a comprehensive funding agenda from the development of new research infrastructures through support to further development of existing ones, development of new technologies, development of new solutions, development of new services. We have now, this year, we've had a dedicated call to the greening dimension of research infrastructures, because some of them are significant energy consumers and they have a significant space for becoming more environmentally sustainable. So we want to look at that. There is a strong interest actually to provide more funding for these type of activities at European level because of the implementation of the Green Deal and the adaptation to climate change. And we want to stimulate also long-term planning of RIs at the level of communities to come together and to have a vision for in which direction and what is needed for certain communities of RIs to further develop over the coming years. And we would be ready then if these activities are successful, we would be ready to further support them with targeted actions that would help to materialize this development and make these the new activities that would be envisaged a reality. And we have, of course, a number of activities linked to EOSC and and providing the data running the such infrastructures. That means that I should stop through IOSC. And thanks a lot. I'm stopping.
So thank you very much. Perfectly on time again. So I would encourage people who are online, if they have questions, to submit them in the chat function on Zoom, and we will pass them on to the respective speakers here in the room. We're just about to take our coffee break, so we're going to take 20 minutes, and that'll be the occasion for you to ask questions for the different speakers. Dominic said that the RI landscape was complicated, and I think you saw from the different speakers this morning that that RI landscape is also implanted within a pandemic preparedness landscape that itself is also extremely complicated. And I'd really like to thank very sincerely the speakers for illuminating in such a clear way that complexity. I think we've all learned a lot this morning. So thank you very much. We'll start again in 20 minutes. It's time to start again, so please come and take your seats. Those of you enjoying the view, you need to come back in.
Okay. No, it's a very big city. But a lot of opportunities. Yeah.
Could you please take your seats? Okay, so this is the last request for people to sit down. We are going to start. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Nicholas Blomberg. So Nicholas is Director General of Elixir, which is the European research infrastructure focusing on bioinformatics. And he is also coordinator of BiCovid, and he'll be telling us about the links between BiCovid and ISIDORe.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I guess this is a litmus test on how interesting I am if people drift back out of the balcony. Thanks for that. So I'm coordinating a project called BiCovid, and I'd like to give a little bit of a context around why that project was. That's fine. A little bit of a context on why that project was started, and then I'll end with, I hope, is a few interesting questions. And I think a lot of those questions will be picked up in the afternoon sessions, really, when we start to look at data management. So maybe this is the transition into sort of the more ISIDORe nuts and bolts of the program. That was a bit unexpected. No worries. Ah, yes. Okay, excellent. So this is quite obvious what this is, I guess. So it's about the 261st characters of the SARS-CoV-2 genome, and this is of course at the heart of what we have been doing over the last 3 years. This is actually now the most sequenced organism on the planet. There is about 6.5 million of these reads, and actually probably you're looking at the most frequent sequence on the planet, because the 261st amino nucleotides, there isn't a great deal of variation. All the Omicron type variants came much later in the sequence. But just a few things on this before we dive in. And so one of the, of course, this has been really important for the monitoring and the evolution of the pandemic, and using this data has been instrumental in shaping a lot of policy responses. But there is a couple of other interesting aspects of this. And so it's 6.5 million sequences. And actually the volume of data now is such that the processing of this data becomes a bottleneck. And we've had to start to work with the large exascale computers in the Euro HPC centers to actually to be able to process these type of data volumes in real time. And at the height of the pandemic, there was about a lag of a couple of months for actually processing the data. And the reason for that processing is that what you see here is actually the outcome of an experiment. And so this is the assembled sequence. So that's the sequence of the virus, but actually that's not what comes out of the instruments. The raw reads are quite different. And how you put together those raw reads will matter in the detail of this sequence. That didn't matter so much for the tracking of variants. So people looked at consensus sequences and tracked the variants, but it matters a lot for science. And actually one of the unexpected but interesting pieces of science that happened during the pandemic was all the mathematicians that suddenly had to figure out, how do you do phylogenetic trees? How do you actually compare 6.5 million sequences? Because we've never, ever been close to that volume of data before. And for those type of experiments, which are really important for the future, you do need to have consistent processing. And so that's one of the things that we've been trying as a research infrastructure to collect and make sure that it's not only the immediate response, but it's not only the immediate response, but it's actually also making sure that we leave a trail of data from that immediate response that is available for future research into pandemic preparedness. And I guess 2 more points to this, and then I move on. The third point is that if you look at those 6.5 million sequences, actually about 90% of those come from only 5 countries. Actually, about half of the sequences come from a single institute, the Sanger Institute in the UK. And in Europe, it is Germany and Denmark that's contributed the vast amount. And so the 5 countries are UK, Germany, US, Denmark, and Switzerland in that order. And that's about 90% of the data. And so really harvesting the data from all the different labs have been a huge effort during the pandemic. And we've been working with networks across Europe to try to get and capture that data. But the third thing is that this data really only makes sense in context, right? It's not only the sequence. We really need to put this in context. And I picked a paper. It's more or less on random, but I think it's a really nice illustration. It's a couple of years old, but this is a comparison of various types of coronaviruses, not only the human ones, but also the ones that exist in nature, and then trying to understand how the surface protein binds to different type of antibodies. And then of course you can try to map that onto the structure. And I think this is a nice link to the ISIDORe project, because if we look at the capabilities and the type of calls that are coming into ISIDORe, it is actually quite a lot of these experiments are the facilities that we are enabling. And so the question, of course, becomes how can we harvest this data and make sure that it's available for the research community? Because this paper relies on these databases. They didn't do all the experiments. They went back into the databases and put their experiment in the context of all the other data that's been collected by the community before. And the next point of that is that you just don't dive into the database and pick out the data. That's quite complicated. And so you rely on a whole source of different tools and databases built by the community. And so this is another paper looking at the single cell of SARS-CoV-2 entry. But actually, if you look at it, the way they understand their single cell data is through an Estonian tool called gProfiler. And actually, gProfiler gets all the data from EBI through an aggregate database called Ensemble, which in turn draws on 5, 6, 7 different databases, which is where the data from the research infrastructure facilities are submitted. And so really what you have to try to do is to get this flow of data and then put it in the hands of the researchers, because the individual researchers shouldn't need to go back and dive into every single complicated data point. And so that's really the start of by COVID, and it's the start of the COVID-19 data platform. And so at the start of the pandemic, we worked with our national partners and with the EMBL EBI, supported by the European Commission, to try to sort of put together all the relevant data around SARS-CoV-2. And so that's essentially a SARS-CoV-2 view on all the scientific data available in the open databases. And of course, this is now being taken forward. There is a Monkeypox view, and there is what we call a pandemic preparedness portal, where you can go in and look at different pathogens. But it's essentially a lens onto these data resources. And I think that this is the starting point for the By COVID project, because the By COVID project was essentially created to work across scientific communities and help to find ways of effectively harvesting the research data so that it can be presented back into the research community. So that's the simple idea. And yeah, I think that, so essentially the workflow is quite straightforward. There are some details around this, but the workflow is really quite straightforward. Is that the data generators, the researchers that come to the research infrastructure facilities, they will get support to deposit data into open data infrastructures. And then we aggregate that so it can be easily consumed by the research community. And so it's essentially providing that lens onto the contextual data. And that's been quite used. So if we look at the COVID-19 data portal, it's been a lot of work around the various type of tools and services in the pandemic response. It's been used in public health reporting through another EC project called VEO, who've been looking at sort of the details of variations and try to work down and make comparable pipelines to validate a lot of the statements that were done in public. And of course, all of that hinged on a sort of concerted campaign of data mobilization. And so that brings us to the By COVID project. So what we're setting out to do is really to enable that sharing, access, and analysis of data from outbreak-like research. We want to make sure it can be mobilized from various research infrastructures, from national centers. We want to make sure it's fair, and so we can link it up. I'm not going to talk about that a lot today, but I think that's really where we made quite a lot of nice progress. And then make sure that that is translated into tools, and so that the developer and the analysts easily can access this data. It's a relatively big project. It's not as big as ISIDORe. We're quite pleased with that. I think ISIDORe is a large one, but really we cover most of Europe, and importantly we cover a lot of the multidisciplinary data centers who are working in the pandemic. And so I think this is the key slide for that. We have some of the European Commission large sort of infectious disease projects funded. So VEO, Recoded, Accelerate are all project partners. So we work with them to try to harvest the data. We're working with priory, which is the public health information research infrastructure. It's led by Cienzano in Belgium. So they're trying to integrate a lot of data and take that into policy advice. And then, of course, we have a number of research infrastructures, not only in the life sciences, but actually also in the social sciences. So SHOC, and one of our actually achievements to date is that we've managed to cross-link the social science archives with the COVID-19 data portal. So you can now go in and look, if you look for vaccine or vaccine studies or vaccine hesitancy, you can also pull out the social science studies on vaccines or vaccine attitudes, which I think is a really quite a nice achievement. I know that ECRIN, I see Jacques is somewhere here, you've done a similar work with the clinical trials and the social science, so we're hoping to expose that very soon. And of course, all of that hinges on a lot of very detailed crosswalk, where in the metadata from the different studies, it's quite hard work. But I think this is really exciting how we can be that sort of engine of interdisciplinarity. And so really what we're trying to do, the COVID-19 data portal, or whatever sort of outbreak skin you put on that technology, monkeypox or what we need to deal with in the future, it really hinges on mobilizing data from a lot of different places and then try to put that together in a relatively consistent way, connect it up in the data portal, and then project it out again into users so that they can make sense of this data and put it in context of their experiments. So all of that starts, of course, here at the different centers. So if we don't find ways of mobilizing that data, then the whole house falls over. That's really the foundation. And I think that's what I'd like to focus on in the last couple of minutes, is really on the data management. So data management is really, really hard. Most researchers find this difficult, right? It's and it can be really overwhelming. And actually the support to data management can be overwhelming. There are so many initiatives, there's so many guidelines out there, there's so many pointers, so you actually don't really need to know where to start. But the other problem there is that actually the support can be quite underwhelming, because in that ocean of guidelines and recommendations on fair and open data, a lot of it is actually quite generic and high level. So when you sit there with a single cell experiment, you don't really know how to take that forward. And you don't really know how to map the metadata to make it into one of the bigger archives. And so I think that's really the space where we'd like to come in, is really trying to sort of navigate that underwhelming support and bring the generic recommendations of FAIR down to really sort of almost recipes for the researcher, where they can take a data set and bring that in. And actually one of the tools that we have is called the FAIR Cookbook, where we collect these recipes. And so we do this in by COVID, what we call the Infectious Disease Toolkit, which is really a collection of these recipes and recommendations within the different communities. And it's going to be launched a little bit later this year. But we actually had a contentathon just about a week ago in Ghent, where the community came together and really tried to write these recipes and write the recommendations in the different spaces. And so that, I think, will be really I see Roman is nodding. I think this is really going to be at the core of the ISIDORE by COVID link, is to create these recipes and find the right pipelines that connect the experiments that are coming out of the open calls from ISIDORE into the data portal and then project it further out. And so that's really where I'd like to stop and seed some thoughts for the discussion in the afternoon. I think this is really exciting. I think this link between ISIDORE and by COVID really can be a template for how we do what Dominic called the more policy relevant access calls, but really think about what is the data that we're generating with the research community. How do we make sure that translates into excellent science in the individual research project, but also bring that together in the larger context of life and actually also social and environmental sciences to enable some interesting interdisciplinary research. And we've just published a very nice paper on how to integrate. So Roman led on that. And I think it's on Zenodo, but I think it's being published right now. Not yet. It's coming soon. But do read the preprint on Zenodo. We are practicing open science. So I leave you with that, and I think we can do the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to pass now on to the ISIDORE success stories. So ISIDORE has been running for 1 year. We've already, as a consortium, provided services for different user communities. And now we're going to hear some examples of how successful this has been. So Claire at the back. So the first speaker, because I don't have that on my agenda. So let me give you the microphone. Who is online?
Yeah, so if we have Simone online, you can unmute and start sharing your screen as well.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to describe briefly the results that we got from ISIDORE grant. In particular, it belongs X-ray studies design of new derivatives of 81001 as new inhibitors of main protease of SARS-CoV-2. The project was carried out through strategic infrastructure at EMBL Grenoble, in particular using the crystal direct technology. We used to give a fast response to pandemic a drug repurposing strategies. In particular, we adopted this molecule that currently is at phase 3 or clinical trial for treatment of celiac disease. And we chose this molecule because this share, as you can see here in blue, some structural motif with the other two co-crystallized peptidomimetics or MPRO SARS-CoV-2. That's why we started with the in silico analysis and then experimental threat assays to demonstrate the binding of this molecule against MPRO. But its antiviral activity was very low. So we decided to design a new higher affinity inhibitors, in particular, taking the structural suggestion from our in silico approach. We observed that some N-terminal residues and C-terminal residues of this octapeptide largely fluctuated during molecular dynamics simulation, suggesting that they didn't give a great contribution to the lineup of ligand protein complex. And in particular, we also observed that this peptide bond between leucine 4 and valine 5 is very close to sulfur atom of cysteine 145 that is responsible for hydrolytic activity of SARS-CoV-2 main protease. That's why we decided to shorten the length of this octapeptide to 3 peptides and to convert this carboxylic group into an aldehydic one in order to have a possible covalent bond with the protein. So through an hybrid approach of molecular modeling, synthesis, and threat assay, we identified compound 4 as the most promising. In particular, it presented a very comparable activity with respect to our used reference compounds calpeptin, that is a covalent inhibitor of main protease. In particular, we also obtain a very similar KD respect to the reference compounds, suggesting that also compound 4 could make a covalent bond with main protease. That's why we started with the X-ray analysis. In particular, we got that, as you can see here, from the continuous density map between sulfur atom of cysteine and aldehydic group compound 4, there is the formation of the covalent bond. In particular, there is also a well accommodation inside the canonical catalytic subpockets of the enzyme. And the compounds also give a network of nitrogen bonds with the macromolecule by its backbone atoms, in particular by histidine at position P1 of the 3 peptide. And there is also a van der Waals contribution by the phenylalanine at position P2. So we obtained also an improvement on antiviral activity. As you can see here, we have some activity against the Chinese and UK variants, but compound 4 is still not active against the South African variants. And he also presented a very safety profile. So we decided at this point to improve the activity of compound 4, in particular, as we described that this activity should be given by the low membrane permeation. We decided to improve this pharmacokinetic feature of the molecule. In particular, we decided to modify chemically the CAP group at N-terminal because, as you can see here from X-ray studies, this group is not directly involved in interaction with the macromolecule, so it can be modified because it's not a pharmacophore of compound 4. That's why we designed 2 analogs, 57 and 58, introducing a BOC group and an octanoid group here. And in order to verify if this chemical modification affected binding, we further carried out X-ray studies. In particular, as you can see here, binding was confirmed, and also there is a quite overlapping binding with respect to compound 4. Also here is clearly demonstrated the formation of the covalent bond between cysteine 145 and the aldehyde group, these new analogs. But in particular, we also observed that compound 57 is able also to accommodate its Boc group in the subpocket S3 of the enzyme and form an hydrogen bond by its carbonyl of Boc group with glutamine 189. And in particular, we also have an improvement of antiviral activity, especially for compound 58. Indeed, as you can see here, we reach the low micromolar range activity against UK variant and Chinese one. And also the activity against the South African variant was also greatly improved. And still, compound 58 maintain a low toxicity in cells. So through these studies, we in particular obtain new guidelines to design new generation of compounds, particularly if the future clinical studies will fail. And we also identified the minimum sequence length to improve the affinity towards the macromolecule and the consequent antiviral activity. And we also demonstrated for the first time, at least for main protease of SARS-CoV-2, that is possible to introduce in position P1 and histidine resonance to mimic the glutamine or natural substrate of this enzyme. This is different with respect to many reported mTOR inhibitors reporting as a surrogate of this natural glutamine, a gamma lactam, that it requires further synthetic steps for its production, increasing time and cost for the synthesis. And we also demonstrated the possibility to interact with the pocket S3 differently from other reported main protease inhibitors. And
I'm very sorry to have to interrupt you, but in the interest of time, can I ask you to finish in the next 15 seconds?
Yes, we obtained also in animal studies the demonstration of the safety profile and also a great bioavailability by intranasal administration. So thank you for your kind attention to all collaborators.
Thank you very much. So the next presentation is going to be from Harold Marcotte from the Karolinska.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Harold Marcotte. I'm from Karolinska Institutet. I am associate professor. And I'm going to talk about the characterization of one of our neutralizing antibodies. So this was supported by ISIDORe. So next slide, please. So the work was performed with the support of EU open screen infrastructure. The service provider was Luca Varani and Mattia Pedotti at IRB in Switzerland. And the service provided was antibody characterization. So next slide, please. So we had isolated this antibody that was broadly neutralizing. So what we wanted to know is to understand the binding region, so the epitope of this antibody, by combining biophysical techniques and computational analysis. So the work performed with ISIDORe was the inhibition of the spike and RBD to the human ACE2 receptor, epitope mapping, computational simulation, and also affinity measurement. So next slide, please. So I will just briefly go through the results. So first, it has been shown that the antibody could inhibit the binding of RBD and S protein to human ACE2. Next slide, please. Then 19N01 could not bind in presence of antibodies C121 and 135, for which the epitope was already known. So they were cross-competing, so that was suggesting that the epitope of 19N01 was overlapping with that of C121 and C135. Next slide, please. The antibody recognized most of the mutants and variants, but the binding to RBD was affected by mutation in position 444 to 446. From this experiment on the binding and experiment on the cross-competition that I have shown earlier, there has been a model that has been derived by IRB. And you can see here the 19N01 that can bind to the RBD. So this is the model that was designed. On the next slide, please. So they have also shown that the antibody could bind with high affinity to variants B1, B2, B45. Next slide. So in conclusion, the antibody was targeting a conserved epitope. It could be a good candidate as a therapeutic agent, but in combination with other neutralizing antibodies, because there is some variants that were not neutralized by this antibody. And the results were put into a manuscript that has been accepted recently, and fact yesterday it was fully accepted. So I would like to thank Luca Varani, Mattia Pedotti at IRB, EU Open Screen, and also ISIDORE funding. So next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Next presentation will be from Angelika Svetlova, who's at the MPI in Göttingen.
Thank you. So I work in an imaging group actually at the MPI, and we do all sorts of different types of imaging, and we have spoken a lot about COVID today as well. And whoops. So it is relatively clear by now that there are long-term cardiovascular consequences after the SARS-CoV infection. And this is relatively poorly understood by this point because most of our data comes either from cell culture or from patients who have usually had pre-existing cardiovascular burden before the infection with COVID. So we are really interested in on which scale is the heart actually affected and how does it even relate to function. So we have reports of things happening subnuclearly, subcellularly. We don't really know how it translates into the tissue, and we definitely are struggling to connect all of it back together to the function of the heart. So in this case, we're then interested to image the whole heart at different resolutions and multiple scales to see how, at which point the biggest change is happening, and how we can connect it to all of the existing information that we already have. This is what a rhesus macaque explanted heart looks like, and this was explanted after 4 months post the confirmed COVID infection. And the challenges in imaging here are that we are interested in non-destructive imaging, because if we destroy it, then we cannot sort of cycle back between different resolutions. Another thing is that we live in a 3D world, so we are of course interested in 3D features, and the heart is a complex machinery that has 3D features that are important. More relevant to this topic here is that we have a relatively large sample. As you can see, this is 5 by 10 centimeters. We need to have some sort of setup that is able to handle this, and therefore we are needing to image in multiple resolutions. And finally, the heart will actually classify as a soft tissue object, which really limits our options in imaging. Luckily, all of this can be answered by a technique called phase contrast X-ray tomography, which is essentially a free propagating X-ray wave that hits our object. And at the interfaces between tissues with the largest differences in the refraction index, we will create something called a phase shift, and this phase shift will become bigger with the propagation across space until it hits the detector. We are able to reconstruct phase shift, and we're able to get a tomographic image afterwards. The problem with this whole thing here is that we require something that's called a coherent beam. This is a parallel X-ray beam. We need a relatively bright source, and we need to have a flexible setup to move things around in order to have different resolutions. And all of these things can really be only achieved at the synchrotron facility. And we were really promptly and luckily provided access to CERMAP at Elettra by Eurobioimaging and ISIDORE, and we have done our imaging in December last year. So this is how our imaging looks like here. This is at the pixel size of 67 micron here. This is the entire heart scanned through and through. You can see some of the larger features observed. This is the right and the left ventricles. When we zoom in here, you can see the valves, for example. There's some blood in the ventricles. And you can see there's a relatively bright ring growing throughout the left ventricle overall. So we were then able to perform zoom-in scanning. This is a pixel size of now 2 micron with multiple acquisitions. And we are able to sort of look at the brighter, more finer structures of the heart here as well. So since in December, we were then able to image at 2 resolutions, the entire heart here, and then at 2 micron as well, we are able to differentiate different architectures between the healthy heart and the COVID heart. And we have gone even one step further already, and we have imaged the same hearts at the P14 EMBL facility. And there we're able to then reach the cellular resolution as well. And just a small teaser for you of how this looks like now for the last step that we have achieved a couple of weeks ago. These are the individual cardiac cells. This is the beautiful coronary vessel running through. And there are individual subcellular structures that we are also able to observe. So in conclusion, here we were able to, with the help of ISIDORE and Eurobioimaging, we were able to image the entire COVID monkey heart, multiples of them actually, and beginning from the whole heart to a subcellular scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We pass now to Pablo Suarez Cortez, who's at the MPI in Berlin.
Thank you for letting me introduce the project. I've been working with the ISIDORE funding for the last some months. I'm working at the Max Planck Institute for Infection Biology in Berlin, and I want to tell you how we are trying to image the needle in the haystack that is the malaria parasite when it's inside the mosquito. So we are interested in malaria transmission in our laboratory, which is still a disease that affects more than 250 million people per year, and is transmitted, as you probably know, by Anopheles mosquito. The disease is caused by a parasite called Plasmodium falciparum in the case of the humans, and we are interested, as we said, in the transmission stages. That you can see here, it's a fairly complex cycle, but one thing they share is secretory organelles, which you can see in green in the graph. Apart from the secretory organelles, we are interested in a protein called GEST, which we have shown to be present in all 3 stages of the transmission parasite. Interestingly, GEST is important for transmission. So when we had parasite without this protein, they didn't transmit properly, but we still don't know how this is important for transmission. What is the biological process? We started to investigate it on the gametocytes because they are readily in the laboratory. It's possible to culture them and to purify them. So then it's possible to do electron microscopy in our local facility. Here you can see the activated gametocyte and the difference between a parasite, a wild-type parasite, in which the secretory organelles are secreted. They are no more in the activated parasite. And here in the green arrow, you can see that after activation, secretory organelles are still present in the parasites lacking the protein of interest. However, when we went to ask about occanids and sporozoites, the problem was that these parasites are not possible to culture in the laboratory in vitro. They reside inside the mosquito, and therefore they cannot be properly purified. We even tried to take it to our local microscopy service, but the samples we were taking, they were just not able to find the parasites within. So here we had a goal, which is to understand better the role of these organelles during mosquito infection by the parasites, and the need which was to find a way to identify the parasites within our samples. That's where ISIDORE and Eurobioimaging comes into play. When I learned about this initiative, I contacted them with the idea for the project, and they put me in contact with the node in Prague with Marie and Jirka, which work in Budweis in the Czech Republic. And they were not only very happy to participate in the project, but they also contributed with their expertise on what we should do to get the most information out of the imaging. So in the end, the goal will be not only to localize the parasites within the mosquito midgut to be able to image them, but also to do electron microscopy reconstruction of them to get the most information. So I want to show you very preliminary results that we have done in the last month, because this project started just in February. And on the one side, on the parasite localization, they are using CLEM, which is very simply corresponds to correlated light electron microscopy, meaning that they can look at the light microscopy of a sample. In this case, this is, as you can see here, it's a mosquito midgut, which I dissected in my laboratory and sent after staining for the parasites to the laboratory in Czech Republic. They are able to select these regions, and the next step will be to generate electron microscopy reconstruction of these specific parasites within the big midgut. I also wanted to show the initial electron microscopy of parasites that has been done so far in gametocytes, and this is done, again, it's all in the name. It's a serial imaging by scanning electron microscopy of a block with the parasites inside. And this is a very preliminary image of a gametocyte. This scale is about 10 micrometers for the full cell that you can see here. And as you can see, we have high resolution data of the ultrastructure of the parasite, which will allow us to understand better between the activated and the non-activated parasites, how these organelles are important for infection of the mosquito. So that's the end of my presentation. The next step will be to work. So we have the gametocytes already done, and we want to go now into identifying and imaging the organism in the sporozoite. We don't want to stop at the descriptive data. We want to compare also between wild type and knockout parasites to understand better what is the role of this protein during invasion. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And our final short talk is coming from David Morrow, who is at IATRIS.
Everybody, we'll finish off on your favorite topic, regulatory science. Very briefly, because Jonathan will probably kick me out. The idea of the work package is to provide regulatory support. IATRIS does the early part, ICRIN then jumps in and does the later part. So one of the true wow factors of ISIDORE is that if we can't do it, they can do it, ERINHA can do it, and that's a great benefit to the applicant. So we all know that assessing regulatory issues is integral for biomedicine development. We know that if you don't do it, it's going to imply extra costs, project delays, and so on and so forth. And also, it can help prevent penalties from non-adherence to the requirements. So basically, IATRIS brings in a kind of a group of about 8 experts that we actually put together in the Transvac project. And yes, William, I still know we have a deliverable. Stop giving me evil looks. And also a database that helps be able to identify the resources you need around Europe. So very, very briefly, let's give you 2 examples. Norwegian company comes to us. They're developing a COVID-19 therapeutic with X as the active drug, and they have a current trial with a topical gel. But now they want to evaluate that dose in subjects with COVID-19, but this time with a new formulation. So they need assistance. They need support. Do they need to carry out a safety tox study in animals? And again, this may be very kind of obvious to everyone in this room, but to a small company, it's not. Do they need to carry out a dose finding in healthy volunteers, or can they go directly into patients? 1 hour meeting with an expert, we're able to tell them what they do, what the appropriate model they need to use, push them in the right direction in ISIDORE, use a ferret model, I think in this case, and also basically give them advice on how to go for an ITF. Again, it may be simple. That was a 1 hour meeting. Second example, we have a company, a new startup in Slovenia. They are looking at a new vaccine-like particle candidate, and they want to do a proof of concept in a mouse model. They have no experience whatsoever in regulatory, and they're looking to help implement the various aspects of vaccine design and at what time. So we come in again, 1 to 3 hours of advice, help them with their ITF application, help them on developing a target product profile. We provide advice on the clinical safety studies in preparation for that phase 1 trial. And again, as I said, walk them through the steps that you need to do for an innovation task force. So again, I think the take-home message here, I think, for everybody is, if you're about to hand over 50,000 euros or 5 million to somebody, why not make sure they have a 1 hour Q&A session with a regulator? Does that not make sense? So IATRIS does that with charities, and I would really strongly recommend for all of you, before you provide a service is have the regulatory support they need, 1 hour session, and that's it. Well, actually, I'll tell you what, both those projects were less than €1,000. So how much would it cost if you go down and use the wrong model? So again, I strongly encourage you, we were able to, through the Transvac project, we put together a team of 8 regulators, use us, and that's it. Thanks for shopping.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. And I think this session has just shown the breadth of services that are available under the umbrella of ISIDORe. And I'm sure there are going to be plenty more success stories to come in the next couple of years. So really the service provision is getting up to full steam now. And so I think we're in a very good position. So we're going to have a round table. There's going to be a minute to put the chairs in place. And as they are, I'll actually introduce our panelists. So I'll start with the people we've already seen. So Audrey Richard, who is Director of Operations at ERINHA. So she is, has a background in virology, having studied been at 6 years at the Scripps as a staff scientist, interested in West Nile, dengue, Zika viruses. She joined ERINHA in 2019. Dominic, I won't try and say your surname this time. So he joined DG Research and Innovation in 2005, initially in socioeconomic sciences and humanities. 2014 joined the Research Infrastructure Unit as Executive Secretary of S3. And since 2021, he's Deputy Head of Unit for Research and Innovation Actors and Research Careers, and working on infrastructure policy, and has been a fervent supporter of research infrastructures. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. Andreas Hotel has a background in microbial genetics, then became an institutional grant manager. 2001, he joined the EU Commission's Health Research Directorate, infectious diseases, vaccines, brain research. 2019, Horizon Europe, Horizon Research Infrastructure Program focused on biomedical research. He's now seconded to the European Executive Research Agency implementing EU-funded research infrastructure projects. So he knows all about what we're going to be talking about today. And now we're going to have 2 other external speakers. So Andrea Vuta, who has a research background in endocrinology. She became a clinical trial manager. She joined BBMRI in 2014, heads the quality management department, acts as technical assessor for national accreditation bodies, and is liaison officer to the international standard organizations, all the ISOs that we all so dearly love, and is here representing BBMRI in the context of the CANSERV project. And likely Michel Boer, who is a Renaissance man, and what else can one say? So he was involved in the co-discovery of gravitational waves, leads a network of telescopes for space surveillance, and is now Director General of ANI-EE, which is the research infrastructure on experimental ecology, coordinator of AgroServe, a project about adaptation of agriculture to climate change and the agroecological transitions. So thank you all very much for agreeing to join us here. So we, as you know, had some prepared questions. Before we go into those, perhaps I could just ask Andrea, do you want to just one very quick overview of CANSERV, what its aims are, its organization?
Sure. So the daughter or the sister project, CANSERV, was born in 6 months ago. It's a $14.8 million euro budget. Well, it's quite the same. And it's about oncology We put also together a network of beneficiaries. We have 19 of it. We have approximately 150 service providers in various fields in oncology, from the development of mouse model disease models to the implementation of these models, technologies and biomarker development into back to the patient on different oncology fields. And yes, we started off. We have now kicked off 2 calls. We have already 1 reply. So I think we are in the movement, but we also faced a lot of difficult times to set this project up.
Okay, thank you. And if you could pass the microphone to Michel. No, the other way.
Sorry.
And just a very quick overview of AgroServe.
Okay, AgroServe, it's also an infrastructure project like ISIDORe, and there are several infrastructure. We have 11 infrastructure from, I think, the smallest thing is probably the molecule open screen to social sciences, and through MIRI, through ANAE, of course, with ecosystems, etc. And the idea is to make some transdisciplinary research services, providing services. It should be interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary to make some research on the adaptation of the agriculture and food systems to the climate change, to the loss of biodiversity, and of course to make the agroecological transition.
Okay, thank you very much for that concise summary. So I should say that if during the discussion you have points that you would like to come in on, just raise your hand and we can have, I think the aim is not to have one of these sterile presentations where each panelist just talks a monologue for 5 minutes. It's actually to have some constructive exchange. And so the same applies for the panelists. If you want to jump in, even interrupt your panelists in a not too rude way, but there's certainly fine. But bearing in mind that we only have 1 microphone between you, which will limit the possibilities for conflict. Okay, so I think perhaps we can have as a first question is, so for these different projects, what would success be? Who'd like to go first?
Okay, so since I'm called to the board, where we actually piece of introduction, because we are after the delegation of implementation of the projects to the agency, we have a kind of split responsibilities. In the past, we will used to work with Andreas pretty much office next to one to each other. I think we had really offices next to each other, where we developed the policy for research infrastructures and we implemented the projects. Now I'm in the part which is developing the policy and the work program, and Andreas is then the one that actually knows how things work. So this is an important caveat because there are 2 sides of the same coin, but we look at things completely differently. So the success, definition of success. I think that, well, I will maybe start with something else, if you allow. What we did with Horizon Europe is we reformed the way that we support access provision or funding of access. We used to have, as you know, many of you know, integrating activities that were composed of 3 essential pillars: transnational access program, joint research activities, and networking activities. Now we've created, at the end of Horizon 2020, we've had over 90 such networks funded. And we, first of all, could not sustain that anymore financially with the budget that we had for Horizon Europe. Second of all, we needed to see how to move on because there was a certain level of dependability on EU funding that was within some of these networks. And that over the longer period of time could not be sustained. So what we were trying to see with some those that are more advanced at the end of Horizon 2020 is to look at the more sustainable models of operations of the networks providing access. And with Horizon Europe, we adapted the model that we work with. So we have the infraserves that is represented here by the 3 projects of the first wave, where we have a different approach. We have an approach focused on provision of services with some limited joint research activities possible in order to improve these services throughout the duration of the project to be applicable still within the project, while the networking activities, okay, as this is a collaborative project, of course, some of them are possible, but they are not really one of the essential elements, and the longer term development of services or technologies is taken out completely of these activities, and we fund it through different types of calls, which we call infratechs. So for us in this discussion, what is very interesting is to see, first of all, how this model works. So the first thing, which is, I think, a definition for success for me, is that when we implemented this based on challenges, and here we have infectious diseases, for ISIDORE, we have colleagues on cancer and agriculture research. The first success is that this project brought together a variety of different communities that were related, but that didn't necessarily have a logical platform to cooperate closely. So establishing more permanent structures for this cooperation would be, for me, apart from a successful access program, would be for me a key success factor. And what we need to learn from that is whether this model works, to what extent it works, how we can improve it, and whether the 3 pillars that were there, which are still essential, but they are supported in different ways, whether we still can, whether what we do still provides sufficient support. So you are kind of guinea pigs for us.
Thank you very much. And I think we all agree that as far as when you say making it work, it's really for the scientific community. As a mechanism. So since we're staying on the institutional side,
another way to describe our job sharing is that it's the ideal world and that it's a modeling, and this is the harsh reality that is us here implementing. So, I mean, just to put it up front, I think there was good intentions, and I think there was a mandate at the start of Horizon Europe to do more for impact. So our infrastructure sitting in the excellence pillar for the basic science support were asked to also contribute to support research on the thematic societal challenges. So that was the origin of that idea. I think it was a good idea. It was sort of to have these existing infrastructures assemble their services on a thematic challenge. Now on the difficulties, it is then something that it involves clustering of many infrastructures. That is another talk about the lessons learned to talk later, I think. But I think a success for us would be to see at scale services, research support delivered to communities. And we have seen nice examples today already, but this at scale in a sustainable manner there, that would be what for us, being close to the research communities is the main success to be seen. Yeah.
Audrey, do you want to add anything to that, or is that?
I mean, I'm probably more on the operational aspect also, where I tend to think that the success of ISIDORE would be seen mostly on the impact that will happen on research, on researchers. And I hope that we can do also maybe a little bit on the visibility of the mechanism, transnational access, and that type of support. Of course, researchers, they do go after direct funding a lot, but there are still like a lot of opportunities to be taken from transnational access and access to all those capacities and resources that exist in Europe and also sometimes internationally. So I think one of the success would be, yes, like a lot of users supported, and also that transnational access would become way more of a habit for researchers in Europe.
Okay, thank you.
I agree to all your statements. I would also see an additional success for us. We are looking very patient-centric. And when we look at that, then the improved therapeutic, advanced therapeutic activities from medical doctors in the field that can rely on research that was created on the whole workflow that we have set up in CANSERV, that would be a success for us. So that molecular tumor boards in the clinics recognize our activities and ask for support from the researchers in different fields. And that would directly benefit the patient. And if we could measure this as a success, I think that would be a great KPI for us.
Yeah, what to add to all of that? I think for AgroServe, maybe the success of, if I can, of course, it's in terms of publication of science done and things like that, and we have KPIs for that. I think also one of the main success, and we see already some hints of people from very different community, from the biotechs, including the social sciences, the ecosystem science, etc., which are normally do not discuss. They start to discuss. We are preparing the services, but people start to discuss, and we hope that also it won't be we will have many scientists asking for our services. So we will do that, and then how we see the success also. Of course, agroecology is science, but it's also a set. It's also a technique, so we will have to involve farmers and the agricultural industry, and we will have also to involve the policymakers. And I think so one of the measures of success will be, because we, of course, if we want to make the transition to agroecology, it means, of course, have scientific tools, techniques, but also regulations. And if we succeed in providing, we are not responsible, of course, whether the policymakers make policies on agroecology, but if you provide them with tools to do a nice regulation, I think it will be a measure of success. And of course, the next measure of success will be the sustainability, and we are working for that, and we are looking towards agroecology, living labs, research infrastructure partnership for that.
Thank you. And so if we have time, we'll certainly come back to the issue of sustainability. But before we do, you alluded to it now, but in your introduction, you said it explicitly, interdisciplinarity. So since you've got the microphone, and since you're in this very relatively atypical situation of making this leap from one field to another, how can you trigger a real interdisciplinary culture among our eyes?
I don't have a recipe, unfortunately. It was already hard when we wrote the proposal, because of course everybody is looking at its own backyard, but we succeed already. It was a success to write a proposal which makes sense, and which was in the framework of agroecological transition. And I think this is already means that there was a lot of discussion, and we are taking now 1 year. We are really about to release our first services next September. But we decided to take 1 year to discuss, and we are discussing about ontologies, we are discussing about languages, how to also make integrated services, meaning services provided that already integrates 2 or more infrastructure, and we expect that it will be more than 2. But and it's how we see that. I don't know if it works, because we are in our first year. So I think it will be with time. But what I see is that surprisingly enough, it even surprises me, people are discussing inside the transverse work packages. And we are also participating to new proposals with infrastructures, because thanks to AgroServe.
Okay, so I'm going to a comment on interdisciplinarity? Yes. Okay.
I'd like to build on what Michel just said on the 2 and more infrastructures. I think that's a really important success measure. And if some of us were involved in one of the previous sort of cluster projects, Corbel, I see Antje is smiling, where we tried to do exactly that, to get user projects where the users had to access more than one research infrastructure. It was really difficult. It was very hard, because it needed actually the project managers at the infrastructures to understand the services, the complementarity between the services, so that it could hold the user by the hand and help them. But actually the scientific outcomes in some cases was really interesting. There was, I think it was one imaging project on fish bone cartilage, where they discovered completely new structures that had never been seen before because they access the different type of microscopy that they never seen. So I think that really, from the sort of the whole area of these SERV data projects, that sort of accessing more than one experimental technique I think is really one of the big success measures.
Okay, thank you. And so I'll come back to Audrey, and perhaps if you can just tell us just how broad the requests for services has been within a single request. So ones that have asked for different research infrastructures to get involved, whether there have been any particular challenges that involved in that. And as far as I know, there hasn't been a single project that's involved experimental science and social science.
No, not yet.
Is that something that we could cope with within ISIDORE?
Yeah, we could cope with it. Something I want to comment for interdisciplinarity is that also integrating the services and providing access to several research infrastructures on paper, it looks very good. It looks very good for us as well. But we have also to wonder whether or not it's really addressing user needs. They usually know exactly what they want. And sometimes we might want to push models that may not always be adapted to user needs. That being said, sometimes users also need guidance, and if they were offered like some packages of services, that may also probably improve the outcome. So I think we need to find like a nice balance between those that know exactly what they want, those that need a lot of guidance. Pushing for integration can definitely, not necessarily pushing, but promoting and encouraging integration can be done. We have received very different types of requests for services. When we do need to involve other research infrastructures, it's true that it may not have been identified by the user him or herself. This is something that we identify, all the access managers that are like really involved from all the research infrastructures in ISIDORE access management. They are the one in that case that are going to say, okay, we can do this one from that research infrastructure, but for that type of outcome that you want to achieve, then you're going to need another one. So I think this is something that we have built around an Mpox project where there was like a need for instruct services, but also some access to Mpox patient samples, and also some EU open screen services. That's the type of chain that we are trying to implement. And unlike AgroServe, that took time to think about those aspects, because of the nature of ISIDORE, we had to launch actions in response to SARS-CoV-2 before we could really like necessarily finalize and polish certain aspects. So we're definitely probably rougher around the edges than you're going to be. So yeah, that's but most of the time people are like, I want this, and this is like fairly straightforward. We guide a number of them, probably like, I don't know, 15 or 20% of them, they need like a little bit of guidance and a little bit of more support than they thought and they needed. So in that case, we involve other research infrastructures. That's a lot of words for not that much. I don't know if I answered the question.
No, absolutely. And I think finalizing and polishing is a bit of a euphemism. I think some people describe it as building the plane as you're flying.
No, just to come back on the aspect of interdisciplinarity, that is something, of course, that we like to enable. We are a SERV project. We try to serve needs and gaps. So it's very much encouraged, and we should enable interdisciplinary use of several infrastructures. We should not prescribe it as a must there, because then we sort of put in another layer there of complications also in our work programs. We should be careful in the wording that we don't make it even more difficult to use our infrastructure there. That was a small comment.
No, absolutely. It should be an opportunity and not a constraint.
Yes. So for CANSERV, we have similar experiences now, but I would like to say that it was already in the developing phase of the proposal that all these colleagues from all research infrastructures, we have 18 of them, put together their thoughts and knowledge about cancer research and what they can contribute and what they have as knowledge, what a user might need, and what they know that it is at most requested. So we put the basis of our services on this knowledge behind, but we will see at the end what the user definitely needs, and we will try to adapt to it. But I think already in this proposal writing time, there was a lot of brain invested in the whole concept. And it would be, and that's what I would like to say, is the sustainability of such new funding schemes would also be very important, so that it doesn't end after 3 years, that it is continued, because we are bringing people on the viewpoint of EC direction, which is per se an endeavor, because hospital researchers are not used to look in the same direction as EC does. Maybe they have different layers in between the university strategy, vision, and so on. And I think for us, it is challenging. It was challenging, and we are looking forward to what the outcome will be.
Okay, thank you. And we now brought up again mobility, which is obviously a key point across the research infrastructures. But before going on to that topic, I was going to ask whether there were comments or questions. So that's very timely.
Yeah, thanks a lot, John Eriksson from Eurobiomaging. I would like to echo what the panel said in many respects when it comes to sustainability and the other aspects. But Dominic pointed out in his presentation a few items that the InfraServe projects can be really useful for. And so first of all, a long-term sustainability model, which was touched upon by many of the presentations here. The outreach, you talked about marketing, but basically it's increasing awareness. And then some kind of dynamic business model in terms of TNA support. So I think this project, including, of course, ISIDORe, which is super visible, can be used to, first of all, with these success stories that we're seeing, if they go well, and I think we saw very nice examples this morning. If they go well, we can use them to leverage the gospel and really show that what we are made of. So that's one thing. And then when it comes to interdisciplinarity, I think Audrey pointed out, and also Niklas, the challenges there, because we get lots of users that know what they want, but then there's a huge actually, I think majority out there that first of all, they're not aware of that we exist, and they don't know what they want. So they have a problem, but they don't know the solution. Often we have solutions that is machines, fancy techniques that are looking for a problem, but it would be nice to have problems looking for solutions, and we would have ways to address that.
No, I agree entirely. And if you have looked onto the ISIDORe application, on the pre-application, we ask applicants to describe in a few sentences what it is they need or what it is they want, with the idea that once we have enough of these requests, perhaps we'll be able to turn around the interface for requests into more not, I know that I want to have access to a bit of clem, but I actually want to do this imaging of a mosquito in a cell, and I don't know how to do it. So absolutely, no, I agree entirely. So we'll pass the microphone across.
Thank you very much, Ole Olsen from European Vaccine Initiative, representing Transvac here. So not far from here, Lionel Messi is playing in Paris Saint-Germain. He earns in about 3 months the same budget as we have for ISIDORe. He's only one person. We are about 150 organizations, and we have to share it over 3 years. So my question a bit, I guess, is to the Commission colleagues is, are you serious about this? Because, I mean, with the very modest budget we have, I mean, it's very difficult to imagine anything really ambitious and sustainable being established over such a short period, such a limited budget.
So
high cost services, yes, like manufacturing, that was already mentioned by Dr.
So
So just to add to what Ola said, because I'm also from Transvac, Monika Ślęzak, we mean, I think, also those quite high-cost TNA services like productions that we are facing, that problems also at ISIDORE.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'll take my role as moderator to protect the Commission. Dominic, unless you would like to reply, Dominic. Okay.
Well, I think that first of all, this is not a fair comparison. We are not sponsoring Paris Saint-Germain, but you know, at an anecdotal level, I'm friends on Facebook with a researcher from Poland who recently, a couple of months ago, wrote something like, well, that she just learned that actually from some other post somewhere that a pole dancer earns in a couple of nights more than she does in a month. So maybe she should consider changing the career, but it's probably a bit too late. So I think that we should not compare things that are completely uncomparable. Now, on the part of being serious, now we are serving with the Research Infrastructures Program. We are serving, as I mentioned earlier, if not the entire scientific community, the very, very broad scientific community, from particle physics to humanities, with everything in between. And we are faced with significant budgetary constraints, so we have to be selective. I actually had a slide in another presentation which was focused on access, which I have it somewhere in my computer, where I calculated a little bit how much money we invested in integrating activities and access provision over the last framework programs. Just to be very rough and not without much detail, more or less in the 7th framework program and in Horizon 2020, we've invested something like 750 million euro over the period of the entire program, each of them, in integrating activities. And that was like 3/4 of the money that we had in the 7th framework program, and it was half of the money that we had in Horizon 2020, calculated taking into account only what we are responsible for in DG Research Innovation, not because this is the RI program is a combination of what we are doing in DG Research Innovation and what colleagues do in DG Connect on electronic infrastructures. In Horizon Europe, as we have a flat budget, and of course that is linked to the proposal of the Commission, but it is discussed profoundly with the member states. So it's not the Commission only, and also not the Commission primarily in many cases. And with the much broader scope of the activities that we need to take care of in the program, we will have roughly 500 to 550 million for infraserves, which is not easy to compare with the past, because now we are actually taking out the longer term focus, the joint research activities, etc. So we would need to see what it means in terms of access. But it's very clear that our budget is limited. And I believe personally that we should have a serious discussion in the planning for the future framework program. What is the role of EU budget in facilitating access? I mean, we would be happy to have an access program, a European access program, covering transnational access to RIs for all the fields of science. But we would need to triple or quadruple our budget. Is it feasible? As you said, Lionel Messi earns so much in a year. Why not the entire research infrastructure program having a quadruple budget? In the big scheme of things, this is a relatively trivial money. But this requires a political decision to go this way.
And if I were a politician, I would listen to researchers asking for that increase in budget and not to the research infrastructures. So I would say that the path is clear. We need to make sure that the users and potential users really want to see this investment. That's absolutely key.
I think so. One discussion is about the budget scale available and what we don't have. The other things, if we can do better with the budget that we have. And if we see, for example, with ISIDORE, we have 50% it goes into TNA, with CANSERV at 60%. And for each project, we have this huge effort there to cluster things and have coordination and advisory bodies. There's a lot of money that is for a one-off in a certain thematic area, and then it's quiet again. So pediatrics or infectious diseases, 3 years, and then there's that is probably not ideal. So I think I would fully support any idea to sort of to move towards an access program, maybe a different type of grants, even that would sort of fuel infrastructure. They exist. It's not a problem that they have sustainability issues as infrastructure. There's a sustainability issue of the service delivery. So that would be just unauthorized brainstorming from the EU officer.
Thank you. I think that's yes. Claudia.
Thank you, Andreas. I think I was going in the same direction, just to compensate through the commission bashing. I'm going the other way. In the last few work programs, we have been some really innovative new initiatives to fund infrastructure in different ways. Some of it really greatly appreciated. The infratech, the having funding to improve our services, not only to give it, highly useful. We have, for access, we have a series of experiments in a way. We have this experiment by theme, like ISIDORE cancer. We have the co-funding now coming, which is a different sort of. Then my question goes towards what you're saying, how we do better with what we have is, we are learning a lot. Through ISIDORE, we learn here in between Pauline and Arina have helped these researchers by the hand to be able to use these very complicated things. And this is just our infrastructures. And we are learning a lot how to use ISIDORE, how to use cancer. I'm sure with the co-fund, we will learn a lot as well. And I was wondering, how do you expect this feedback? How do you expect us to tell you, actually, this was great, but the 150 organizations was a bit tricky, or co-funding is fantastic, but maybe per area will be better than bunch up infrastructures, or whatever. How are you guys expecting to receive our constructive and very grateful feedback?
Sorry, just directly replying to your question. Well, I would start by saying there are 4 or 5 people from the Commission in this room right now, and some online. So feedback starts here. It has started already before, and we are just in the first couple of years of implementation. But our plan is very clear that we are right now working on the strategic plan for the last 3 years of Horizon Europe. It should be ready by the end of the year. We will run consultations throughout. We do that through S3. We have the RI funding to which you were exposed, which also covers funding for access. We have the access group that looks into access modalities, and we are gathering feedback from the research infrastructures. And we've had already internal discussions to actually have a dedicated workshop organized by the Commission with the InfraServe projects funded under Horizon Europe until now, precisely to discuss these experiences and to see how we can improve this scheme for the last 3 years and then take it forward for a discussion for the future framework program. So we have a clear way. You just started and we already need to learn. There is certain time inconsistency, but we'll do what we can.
So these are obviously questions that could occupy us for a very long time. We're coming to the end of this session. So
the word of the coordinator about the budget doesn't sound like it, but when you're the coordinator of ISIDORE, 10.5 million euros to be spent on services is not it's not low money at all. I am very much in favor of the high cost project that were supported. That being said, we still have half of the budget to spend for the rest of the project. So we're doing good. It's not like we have spent 95% of it and we have nothing to do for the next 24 months. So this, I mean, probably a lot of opinions about that, but I'm happy with what we got. And if ultimately at the very end of the 36 months, it does look like it was maybe not exactly enough, maybe we can give that feedback, but I think it's a little bit too early to say that there was not enough money.
One last word also, I think, or Antje want to first? I don't know. One last word is, I think, a good way of, one is, I mean, this exposure that we have here now to your feedback is obviously a very useful one. I also think, I mean, to have a small position paper, as we have seen it from the ERIC access, from the ERIC group, there was a lot on access there, very useful to have. I think if it gets fed into the pipeline on our side, rather high, not too high, but also not too low, then it gets delegated down, it gets delegated up with comments or something. I think that is a way, and it should not come across as a lobbying exercise just for more budget. That is what everybody wants, of course. So if it comes as a substantiated and explanatory analysis, that is totally helpful and it's being read and used.
Okay, thank you. Given the time and given the fact that we've been told that we need to be downstairs early because it's a lovely day and apparently that is going to have some impact on their capacity to service because the terraces are going to be full. What I'd like to just a very quick your impressions of the exchange that we've just had, any final messages that you'd like to share, and then we'll just do for each person maybe 30 seconds, 1 minute.
Okay, thank you. It's difficult to do it. I mean, it's exchanges are nice because I see that we have both commission and fellow infrastructure projects. So it's interesting to see that the other projects have the same problematics than ours. So this is reassuring. Also, yes, and the same about money. I would say, yes, we need more money, but we should also use the money we have. And I think it's a model where the investments are made by the countries and the running money is made in the project. And I think it works. I mean, it works. We can maybe ask, but not to double or triple the budget. So we don't need messy in our infrastructure. Yes.
I want to come back on the guinea pigs. I think, yes, we are guinea pigs in this InfraSurf project lifetime. And I see it complementary. What I would like to point out is, again, the sustainability, because every InfraSurf project is building up access points, is building up a infrastructure and serves users, which will be at the end have to be served over the lifespan. And all this costs money. And this access with Instruct comes that the user can have access to our services is something very valuable and should be prolonged over the time. But I think we are heavily depending on EC comments and support, because some of the financial aspects with TNA models are different in ISIDORE and in CANSURF, which needs dedicated answers. And here we are heavily discussing also with our PO, Andreas, and I give it over to you.
Very short. I think it's we heard several times we are guinea pigs, we are learning, lessons learned. I think it's important, it's really good what we are doing, but we don't have all the time of the world. So there is a project that is halfway through, or not 1/3 through. We have a framework program that is halfway through. I think we cannot afford to wait too long and take all the time we think we need for that, all of us, I think. So if you have ideas, we do a lot background work there, also self-critical, what could we do better, what has been overcharging your burden for you. So there can be done also in running projects. I mean, as we don't like amendments too much, but I mean, if there is, you probably need, but I think if there is need to facilitate life and to become more efficient, I think, and reshuffle things to become more output orientated. Let's do that together. And I'm really fully available for any sort of improvements we can do within our time spans we have here.
Well, we don't like amendment either, but you should see the one that's coming your way. It's a good one, but realigning the budget, everything. No, honestly, no further comment. I keep thinking about everything that we have left to do. So, well, I'll give it to Dominic and keep thinking about it.
Well, we didn't like amendments. That's why we delegated project implementation to the agency. But you heard my voice already a lot. I would actually like to maybe hear from Antje then during my time.
Thanks a lot, Dominic. It's actually to the previous session, but maybe it also fits here. I think the major take home that I wanted to bring across to Andreas' comment from before, you see all the budget that goes into the administrative overhead of structuring ISIDORE, but that's also true for CANSURF and AgroSurf. But we are also shipping in a lot from the infrastructures that might not be visible because it's not put on any paper. So the in-kind support that is coming from each of us here is enormous in the background. In principle, we spend the overhead already, or the administrative burden or budget for this in the first months, because in comparison, when you have 50 organizations coming together, it's tiny for the individual one, but the workload is enormous. But I think we are so convinced of that the InfraSurf projects are the right way forward that we are very happy to do this. And we are equally interested, therefore, to make these sustainable structures. It's an investment as we see it.
So thank you. I think that's a very valuable contribution to make. It's certainly the case in ERINHA, and it allows me to acknowledge the enormous work that's been done in the coordination by Audrey, by the entire for free. Yes, it's not a charged cost onto the project. My time is relatively limited on the project, but again, there's no charge, and it's the same across. And so I'd also take this as an opportunity to thank all the ERINHA staff who involved in organizing today's event, which and the research infrastructures for all the work they do on access provision. Yes. Okay, well, so thank you very much to our panelists. I think that really was a very good exchange. It was rich and informative. We're going to have a break now until 1:30. So I hope that this is
and open for externals audience of the event for externals.
Yes. Yes, and for those of you online, we'll be back at 1:30, and for those of you who are following just on the streaming, that's the end of this event. It's now the afternoon, and tomorrow is going to be more internal affairs. So thank you very much.